Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. After the deepening heat, uncharacteristic of May, flooding the streets of the town with a golden, soulful wave of fresh coolness, coming from the dark gray stone of the Catholic Church, the first of which, as legend had it, was laid by the same architect who had once built Notre Dame de Paris. Stephen was literally dizzy and lingered in the aisle, almost tripped, grasped the back of the pew with his hand, and took a deep breath. "Young man, are you feeling ill?" A certain old woman, Mrs. Justin, ducked out from behind him, looking empathetic and sympathetic. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Stephen forced a smile and stepped back, half a step to let the old lady pass. Mrs. Justine, thanking, levied the case forward, her head in a bonnet. Goose powder and silk ribbon roses bobbed, like a flag sailing a royal frigate, and at last it fell silent as Mrs. Justin sank into a pew in the front row, a seat she had been accustomed to occupy for more than half a century. Stephen settled down in one of the back rows, wrote and was glad that no one was sitting next to him, because right now he was dying to be alone. But he had come to church because he couldn't do otherwise, because otherwise he just couldn't take it anymore. The priest, Father Stewart, appeared up front, and the sermon began. In general, Stephen could not call himself a deeply religious man. To be more precise, he had forgotten the last time he had been in such a place or turned to the Almighty. But today he was in dire need of consolation and absolution, because suddenly everything in his life, seemingly settled and more or less bearable, had gone wrong, and the nightmares of the past, the ones he had hoped had been buried long ago, had returned. They came again, and it would seem that he woke up, washed his face, brushed it off, and lived the whole day easily and happily. But the bad dreams, reminding him of all he had done, came tenaciously, and after them Stephen walked like a man out of his mind, and everything fell out of his hands, and in his head replayed those episodes of reality which he longed to forget. Stephen covered his eyes and, folding his hands, tried to listen to what the Holy Father was saying. Not just to listen, but to hear, letting the meaning of each word pass through him. And he was ready to beg anyone, and at any price, if only relief would come, if only they would help him. Stephen did not remember his childhood in Russia. His mother had taken his 3-year-old baby boy and, ignoring the exhortations of relatives, had followed her husband to Ireland. Stephen's father belonged to the Russian community, which seems to have been formed on the Emerald Isle in the 20s of the last century. And then one day, coming as a tourist to his distant ancestors' hometown, he met Adriana. Then he went to Dublin to work, and after a while she announced that she was pregnant. The man was in shock, but did not refuse the family circumstances and began, first, to send money regularly, and secondly, to prepare the papers for the move. And the first memory that was printed in little Stephen's mind was the call home. He cradled the cat so that it blushed the telephone receiver and clapped. "Grandma, I love you. But that's it. That's enough." Mother snatched the receiver from Stephen's hands and, throwing a few angry words into it, hung it up. Somewhere it was like being glued. Next to that memory was another. Stephen playing with a white teddy bear and a fire engine, and then leafing through a book of fairy tales with wonderful and three-dimensional pictures of Ivan the Tsarevich riding a gray wolf through dark forests. All these were gifts to her grandmother from Russia. She never forgot her daughter or her grandson. "I hate you," shouted Stephen in the face of his mother when she announced that she did not. They will not fly to the funeral of grandmother because there is no money. And right on the same day, by the way, Adriana lost all the monthly allowance she received as an unemployed person at the races, and with the second allowance, which was for the child, she bought booze. Bottles clattered on the table, mixed with cans with hidden iron edges and stubble. Canned goods, some of which already smelled bad. Male and husky memorized voices sounded in the room. Mother had visitors again. "We should teach him a lesson." One of the men ventured and tried to grab the 10-year-old by the scruff of the neck. But Stephen dodged and rushed away from the room and the apartment in general with a nose full of tears. And then, sitting on the steps of their brick house, showed himself heartily. He already understood well what death was, and understood even better that now the last and generally the only person dear to him had disappeared. As for his father, he had passed away 4 years after they had moved to Ireland. But Adriana clung to the possibility of living abroad tightly and completely dismissed the possibility of returning home. True, she did not have a good knowledge of the language of indecent profession, but it was possible to receive all sorts of benefits, and the Russian community helped a little. Earlier, the move helped Stephen to adapt rather quickly, learn the language and generally get into the environment. But at the same time, he also adored his native language and was often sad about the fact that fate had ordered his person in such a way. He often thought that if only his mother had not left, things would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have slept. Would the family have held him back? By the time Stephen turned 16, his mother had gone completely downhill. The boy tried to spend a minimum of time at home, and the place where they lived. Now, it was hard to call home, because after the death of her husband, Adriana sold his small but decent apartment. And with the proceeds of the money, Rats lived in an apartment the size of a room that her mother had bought with the leftovers. And through the paint, you could see the wallpaper that the previous tenants had put up. It must have been in the 30s. "You've ruined my whole life," Stephen had said more than once. But his mother only grinned at him and threatened him with her finger. "Look, I was spinning. And I live abroad. My girlfriends must have been jealous of how they were in our province. I live abroad with my son." That's what my mother used to say. I entered the surrounding space with my hand with such a proud look, as if it was the palace of the Queen of England. At school, Stephen was one of the laggards. He also got mixed up with bad company. But in those years of his youth, these guys seemed cool to him. Outcasts of the common man's society, these obscure rebels. They hung around all day drawing on the walls, composing music or poetry. Stephen realized too late that the police knew his group by name for a reason. This group of honeyed youths from the suburbs were into petty theft. They also stole cars and acted as couriers to deliver things. "Brother, help me out." One night, when the streets are foggy, Stephen asked Jamie for help. The guy from this company can't get busy himself. His girls promised a date, you know. Hand it over. And Jamie handed his comrade a small package. "I can still pay," Jamie added with a pleading tone in his voice, seeing the man's hesitation. "Don't be so forward. There's plenty of money here. Where should I carry it?" Stephen asked. And Jane was terribly relieved, instructed him. But something went wrong. That night, Stephen was apprehended by the police. I mean apprehended. After a heart-pounding, fox-like chase. But Stephen wasn't running from them. He didn't know exactly what he was running from, but he was very scared. As for the arrest, the thing was that a policeman identified Stephen as the man who had removed the car stereo the day before. The teenager was taken to the station, and there, by chance, on the same day, several other gang members were arrested, and those whom he considered his friends willingly told about everything Stephen had done with them. Because in this way, they could at least make amends for their own guilt, showing, so to speak, conscientiousness and willingness to cooperate. And from those conversations, Stephen learned that Jamie had died, hit by a car. Stephen thought it would be all right. He waited for his mother to come and bail him out. She was promised she'd be notified, but no one showed up. And the kid, before he even realized what was happening, he ended up behind bars, in a special facility for juvenile delinquents, and the days flew by. Stephen was shocked, terrified. But, as is typical of human nature, over time, he became accustomed to the circumstances, not just resigning himself to it, getting used to it. And when he was released the day after his 18th birthday, he was confused. What to do now? His mother visited him in prison only once, but not to encourage him, to comfort him. She was interested in one thing, whether Stephen had any stash of something left. And then she said he was an idiot because normal sons take care of their mothers. They're behind bars. She left, and after almost 2 years, Stephen had to go back to their apartment. There was nowhere else to go, so he did. His mother was found on the floor, fallen out of her wheelchair. During this time, she had managed to poison herself with logs, whiskey, broken legs, and was not treated. But despite everything she had been through, she continued to drink. "Sonny's back," Adriana whispered through what was left of her teeth and reached for the bottle. Actually, because she couldn't reach it. That's why she fell over. "Help," she called, looking at the bottle. Mother lifted his mother up, and he almost threw up. He'd met homeless people on the streets, of course. This was how they would live with a cold. The windows closed, the air alcoholic and stinky. There's a mountain of garbage on the floor, leftovers rotting on the table, furniture, appliances, everything that used to be of any value has been sold off. "What is this?" Stephen asked, taking a paper from the table. It was some kind of document, and his heart. A bad feeling. And that's the mother behind him gurgling to suck the leftovers out of the bottle. "A bargain," she laughed. "And I thought nobody wanted our villain." "What are you talking about?" Stephen frowned. This little apartment was certainly not the best real estate in Dublin. It was on the outskirts, in a house that needed renovation. But what Stephen heard next shocked him. It turned out that Adriana had sold some people their only home, sold it supposedly for cash. What had it gone for? Stephen knew exactly. And also for exchanging that apartment for some country house, a cottage in the suburbs. The kid exclaimed, "Mom, are you out of your mind? You can't get that much for our apartment." Well. He nervously leafed through the pages of the confusing contract. In general, Stephen was not a real estate expert, but he realized when he saw the numbers. His mother had sold the apartment for 1/10 of its real value. There was also the address of the new property that these realtors had bought for her. "It's time to move out," he mumbled, but his mother is in a hurry. "They say if I don't eat, the police will come." Stephen was breathing heavily, choking on anger, resentment. He realized his mother had been a victim of fraud, but there was probably nothing he could do about it. "Where are you going?" "Get some groceries." "I'm starving." "Drunk," his mother shouted after him as Stephen jumped out of the apartment. The rest of the day the guy spent trying to understand the situation at the place specified in the contract, as the address of the office was a small office, where he was told that everything is normal. The deal is fair. And anyway, what claim does the young gentleman have if he had no rights to that housing? When Stephen went to the police, they listened to him carefully and said that they could not help because the deal was legal. "So you can, of course, go to a lawyer," the elderly officer advised, "but take into account the case risks dragging on for years. In addition, it will cost about several tens of 1,000 euros. By evening, it was drizzling rain. Stephen returned home. He realized it was the end, but he was also brutally determined. "Pack up," he told his mother. "I'll take you home." The thing was that on the way back, Stephen had time to find out what was at the address given in the contract. So he made a decision. He helped his mother gather the few things that were left in her pockets. It was empty, which meant there was no money for a cab. They took the bus first. Passengers interceded, fussed. Stephen could understand them. His mother didn't seem to have washed him for a long time. "Hey, let me help you," said a stout-looking man. "Looks like a laborer," and he helped him lower Adriana out of the bus. Stephen thanked him. They walked the rest of the way. Or rather, he walked to break the cauldron ahead. Here, the poor neighborhoods ended and the industrial zone began. And then they were at the city dump. The authorities had long promised to make the place look decent, but they had never gotten around to it. That's why there are a few barracks, built in the 40s for refugees from the continent. 2 of the 3 barracks were completely abandoned, with boarded-up windows and doors. One of them was still alive, where the homeless lived, and there, according to the contract, was Adriana's new accommodation, a room on the first floor with a broken window and a failed floor. There was nothing here. but technically the barracks was still listed on the documents as real estate. "Here we are," Stephen said. He allowed himself a wicked smile as Adriana began to realize how she'd been duped. "Son." The older woman's lips trembled. "How am I here? Don't leave me, son." She reached out to him, her hands all delicately veined, arthritis-excluded fingers. "Did you choose this life for yourself?" Stephen's back was turned. "You're not my mother anymore, and I don't care if you die here. You drunk, you creep," he shouted, with a shower of tears, and then, turning around, threw himself away. He didn't care. He did it. Nearly 10 years have passed since that day. Stephen hadn't lived in Dublin for a long time. He had left it, having once bought a bus ticket to the west coast of the island with the money he earned. A lot has happened since then. Stephen worked on fishing boats, worked on a farm growing potatoes and cabbages. He's been a builder, a driver. Basically, he did the best he could. He didn't aspire to anything. He understood that a man, especially if he has nothing behind him, has no family support or financial base, for example, in the form of an inheritance, that such a person should try twice as hard to stand firmly on his feet and not let his life go down the drain. But the years flew by, and Stephen still lived as if today. And so fate brought him to this small resort town. Stephen was not a great fan of classical English and Irish literature, but it seemed to him that it was from such towns that Dickens, Austen, and others had written off the characters for their novels. Time seemed to stand still here, the abundance of greenery, the unhurried rhythm of life. Stephen worked on a construction site, or rather, was among the workers who built the house and had to perform finishing work. Although, in Stephen's opinion, taking into account the size and layout of the house, it turned out to be a whole mansion. Working here was interesting from a professional point of view, as well as profitable. Oh, that. And then clapped Stephen on the shoulder. Suddenly he jumped up, turned around and looked at another worker. "I didn't know you were a believer," Matt remarked. "I just came in for a moment." Stephen smiled guiltily. "I just wanted to, of course." He couldn't say that he had a guilty conscience and felt that he couldn't live another day without taking away his sins. More specifically, his major sin of the past. "I understand," Matt nodded. "Mine are sick. Corey, can you believe it? I thought they were vaccinated." The mayor complained about his family's difficulties. He and his wife had 5 kids. "Mary says it's our punishment for missing Sunday Mass. What can we do? We've got a vegetable garden to plant." "You're the one who's been complaining about Matt's life." "I was the one who talked him into it. I said, let's not go all the way to town. Let's just do things in the garden." So she agreed. Especially since my average Johnny, he stole watercolor paints and decided to paint his sister's dresses. Can you believe it? Matt choked on the bag, and Mary was washing, ironing, laying out for the girls so the dolls would show up for Mass. "So, anyway, I sinned and my Mary cursed," Matt sighs. "I got it too," says Johnny. "All over me." "So that's how we didn't go." "So why aren't you in your parish?" Stephen asked, just to be polite and keep the conversation going, because his thoughts were far away from the story of his acquaintance's life. "Well, is it not a good deed?" He came in. "Can I ask where you live?" He doesn't ask, Matt shrugged. "It's just that I'm in town all day today. I have to go to the drugstore, then to the supermarket, to the suburbs. I'll be back tonight. I already went to church. That means I did the right thing. Do you think it'll help my family?" Matt finished, pathetically. "It will," Stephen replied, thinking that it probably wouldn't help him. Or maybe it wouldn't help at all. Some auntie from the front pew spoke up for them, and, turning around, flashed her eyes. "This isn't your priest. Are you here for the temple?" "I'm sorry," Matt was making an appearance. He was a master at it. "We won't do it again." Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. He, too, would like silence now. That's what he'd come here for. Silence. The priest's voice, his wisdom and prohibition. Stephen was determined to confess that sin today and timidly hoped that maybe he wasn't a particularly religious man, but maybe he wouldn't be denied. Maybe all was not yet lost. Finally, the sermon began. The Holy Father started talking about how harmful it was to spend money carelessly and how it could ruin a person in general. Stephen sighed again with relief. He had feared it would be about something family-related, like how it was wrong to abandon his elderly, sick parents. Stephen had lost track of time. He felt like he'd been here forever. He even started to get annoyed that it was taking so long. He immediately gave himself an imaginary slap for such inappropriate thoughts. But at last the sermon was over, and Stephen began to make his way through the congregation. Everyone was saying a different word to the Holy Father. "Do I need to confess?" hotly blurted out Stephen. The imp. "Hello." "Yes, of course." Stuart raised an eyebrow in surprise, but on the whole was not fazed by the assertion. "If you be so kind as to wait for one more person." "Okay." Stephen wiped his palms on his pants and sat down in the pew to wait. The church was almost empty. Stephen glanced nervously at the confessionals, wondering if it would be soon. And when the door opened, he jumped up and was about to enter. But a few moments were enough to recognize the man who had come out of the confessional, and for many years Stephen had not thought of him. His brain had discarded his image as unnecessary garbage for lack of use. Now, however, cold as a stormy sea, green eyes, short blonde hair so white it looked gray. But the man was not an old man. He was no more than 30 now. And then, on the night of the crippled man's arrest, barely 20 came out, cast around. A distracted glance passed Stephen, almost hitting him with his shoulder. Not in his eyes, not in his facial expression, not a shadow of recognition. Stephen, on the other hand, recognized it and knew for sure. There was no mistaking it was him. But how? Why? Now that night was printed in memory as an image on the first photographs of the 19th century with time faded, but you can see the important details. And yet it all seems so unreal. "Sir," the priest's concerned voice brought him out of his stupor. "Stephen shook you badly. You turned pale," added Stuart sympathetically. "Ah, no. Thank you. I'm fine," Stephen muttered. "You seem to want to confess," with a soft, friendly smile. The priest made an inviting gesture with his hand. I, Stephen, did not stop feeling like a great sinner in the blink of an eye. But just now any mood for what I had planned was fading away. "Excuse me, I'll come back later," he muttered, and hurried away from the church to Sun Street, to the air. He urgently needed to get out of the room and into the open. Stephen wandered down the quiet street, where every house was decorated from the front with boxes of flowers and climbing plants, and under the blind of the still sun he sank further and further into the events of that night. He just had to hand over the package. James had given the address and the exact location. He added that the man would come to pick up the package and pay what was due. In the meantime, he gave him an advance. And everything seemed simple. The only unusual thing was that for this Stephen had to turn to an expensive neighborhood of Dublin, where he had never been before. It all seemed an adventure to the young cripple. Jamie said that he was well paid for delivering the shipment, but since he was out of business himself, the money was due to the new courier. That afternoon, Stephen had just had another argument with his mother. She'd blown off what was due on the utility bill, and to relax a little and cheer up, because the matter was murky, he'd stopped at a bar on the way. Stephen saw no contradiction in that. He hated his mother, but he thought he was in control. The only way he could get rid of the alcohol, by the way, was to go to jail, where it wasn't, of course. And in the bar, Stephen ordered the most expensive and strongest drink. He told the bartender, "How old are you, son?" He frowned. "I'm not your son," Stephen muttered and slid a €50 bill. That's the way to go, including bribes. The barman took the money and poured. Then another and another. And when he got to the specified address, Stephen barely kept on his feet. He was confused and almost turned inside out when he realized that in front of him was a cemetery, or rather, the part of it that was melancholically desolate. The sun, meanwhile, had been completely replaced by the moon. The full, milky pale high fence was killed by ivy. And Stephen frowned. There must be a proper entrance here. What would he say, the caretaker? Nothing. It's not a museum. And they don't charge admission. I don't care. Stephen grinned to himself. Maybe he has a grandmother baroness buried here. But it was too lazy to look for the gate. But there was a hole in the fence. In one place, the bars must have fallen out from rust. Stephen was a teenager then, so it was easy to fit through the hole. He looked at his watch. It was still an hour before the appointed time. Well, that's just it, he decided. I'll wait. A cool breeze and a special atmosphere. All these crypts, the statues of angels who seemed to be watching him, all this would sober Stephen up. He was tense and confused, because it suddenly became so nauseating to wait there, in the agreed place, under a huge oak tree, and because there too stood the statue of an angel. He was dropping tears and reaching out his stone hands to someone. Stephen would not let go. The stupid thought that if he turned away for a moment, the statue might come to life, throw itself at him, because he wasn't a very nice person, was he? Vaughn noted another drinking buddy of his mother the other day and whistled after the girls in short skirts, and he disturbed the eternal peace of ladies and gentlemen. So Stephen wandered away, decided that he would walk a little way and come back. He had sobered up, and now he was gnawing with curiosity. What was he handing over for a few 1,000 euros? Certainly not a love note. His fingers took the roll out of his pocket and unwrapped it. Under the dirty cloth was a scrap of newspaper, in which was wrapped a wooden polyhedron covered with strange golden squiggles. It looked like a puzzle. The miniature box with the secret. Stephen began to twirl something in his fingers. What was it? His fiddling with the strange object was interrupted by a strange sound. In fact, it had been heard for about 5 minutes. But at first Stephen had thought it was a night bird. But now it must be because he had gone further into the cemetery. He realized it wasn't a bird or the wind. It was a voice. It sounded like a man reciting poetry. Only it sounded animalistic. It was like a chaotic jumble of separate words, and yet Stephen could swear to it. There was a certain order to it. It was like a song or a spell of dark magic. I'm surprised at the nonsense that comes to mind. The courier began to hastily pack the wooden something back, but somehow he accidentally pressed on the wooden edges, and they opened with a quiet click, revealing a black gut, and in it shone a diamond. Stephen had never seen a real diamond in his life, but he guessed it at once. And although he had never suspected in himself such a craving for beauty, he found himself infected by the pure radiance, like the light of stars in the game of multicolored sparks. The stone was large, even by the standards of gems, huge, and it was scary to imagine how much it was worth. Stephen realized he was holding his breath only when his chest ached and his eyes darkened. The smell of bodies, bread and nervous air. And he started to close the secret box. There was no need to guess. Decent people don't pass gems with boys from the poorer parts of Dublin. So the stones are stolen. Stephen, of course, had been in many stories in his life, but he had never been involved in outright criminality. The strange noises subsided, and at the same time he realized he was no longer alone in the cemetery. He was just lucky he was standing behind another statue, not of an angel, but of a huge dog. Apparently, some rich aristocrat had decided to bury his favorite dog here with honors. Kostya sat down, because a figure separated from the nearest crypt under the creak of closing doors and floated along the path. He could not see the face or the body. Everything was hidden. A floor-length and dark cloak in a hand, draped in a dark glove, swayed an antique-looking oil lamp. Stephen crouched down, clutching at the cold stone in his gut that on no account should he be seen. And when he peered out cautiously, the figure was already melting into the distance. Stephen wiped his forehead, cold sweat coming out. He felt like a character in a Hollywood thriller. "What kind of day is yours?" the guy noted. "Ours." There were almost 40 minutes left till the meeting with the mysterious recipient of the cargo. "We have to wait." But Olga was now gnawing with curiosity, And what was that strange person doing in the crypt? There was definitely a mystery here, and Stephen wanted to solve it. That's why he went to the crypt. "I'll just take one look," the boy promised himself. The heavy door was ajar. Turning on the flashlight on his phone, Stephen dedicated the top. O'Neill read the letters embossed above the crypt entrance, and he realized it was the last name of the family members lying here. Thoughts popped into his head about how there must be a lot of germs in here. Stephen's first teacher, Miss Charlotte Lewis, hated two things: dirty and lack of discipline. The latter was dealt with by the use of a pointer, under which the offenders had to put their palms under. Stephen learned about the fact that children should not be beaten, by the way, only at the age of 13, when the school scandal broke out because of Mrs. Lewis. And for the first, this teacher had hundreds of stories in the style of that one boy ate unwashed apricots and died, and another stroked a stray dog and went blind. "It's a good thing you're not around." Ms. Lewis grinned. To encourage herself, Stephen and stepped into the crypt. Silence. Emptiness. Except for the burials. Well, what else did you expect, you idiot? He was about to leave when he realized there was another door in the back of the building. There must be mice or rats in there. Please let it be rats, Stephen pleaded to himself, because something was making noises. A couple of steps, peering in, devoted to the phones. Sarcophagus on a pedestal, white marble. The lid was made by a skilled craftsman. It depicts a sleeping warrior with sword in hand. "Is anyone alive?" Stephen asked. I wondered why his voice had dropped. "Fear, I suppose." "Oh, that's creepy." But he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. No one answered. So the strange sound must have been imagined. Boom. Luckily, it didn't hit inside the crypt, but outside. A sudden thunderstorm had begun. Stephen jumped up, dropped the phone, which bounced off the corner of the sarcophagus and fell behind it. It was brand new. I'd been saving up for it for 6 months. Where could I get a new one? However, if someone reminded himself Stephen did not behave like an idiot and quietly waited for the client, it was possible to buy a new smartphone with payment. Now it would be impossible to miss the customer at all. What time is it? Does not enter the crypt of poisonous vipers. Thoughts were racing, and not at once Stephen made out what was going on above him. Now there were sounds coming from the crypt itself and from the sarcophagus. It seemed as if someone was lurking there. The scraping was accompanied by a groaning that made the blood freeze in the veins. Earlier, when Stephen sometimes watched horror movies, he used to marvel at how stupidly their characters behaved. But he himself was no better. Instead of picking up the phone and running away, he spread out and stared at the sarcophagus. It appeared as if its lid had shifted. No, it had been lying ever so slightly crooked all along. On an impulse, Stephen began to move it to the side. Then he shone the light directly into the sarcophagus, and what he saw he could not forget. Actually, it was because of what he saw that Stephen went on a panic run, in which he dropped the diamond, dropped the box, and then, in shock, flew out into the streets of the suburbs and ran into a police patrol. He burst into tears like a little boy. And when the officer recognized him as a thief, he did not resist and only nodded in response to the words that "You will go, boy, with us to the station. And there is safe." "And from nerves?" Stephen asked. The two patrolmen looked at each other. "Yes, where else but there?" The younger one answered. "You all right? Are you feeling okay?" "No," answered Stephen. "I don't know. Please save me." The teenager turned up his nose. The flashlight beam, faint but piercing, bright for this time of day, revealed a scene in which nightmare was strangely combined with Gothic aesthetics. True, Stephen hadn't thought about it at the time. His brain just absorbed what he saw and signaled it. "We're in trouble. Let's run and see if it catches up with us." There was something lying among the sweet-scented snow-white lilies. Stephen at first thought it was a sculpture. He saw the tall features of a face made of marble, and part of the face was hidden. On the head of the one lying there was a helmet gilded, or perhaps gold. His attention, however, focused on something else, A few seconds passed, and it came to Stephen's attention. No, it was not a statue, but a man. Another wave of cold fake sweat. It trickled from between his shoulder blades. Had the bartender stirred in the last cocktail? Stephen pressed his palm to his stomach. The syrup was sweet. Cream, tomato juice. But the whiskey made a nasty mess too. Alcohol's evil. Consciousness prompted again. Maybe he'd passed out and was sleeping under a bush. Or maybe it is white fever begins. What are its symptoms? And then Stephen decided to check it out. That's a real person lying there. It's just the way he looked. I mean, it was like he was too perfect. Poor thing, Stephen thought. Must have died young. It's not the money that makes you happy. So it's better to be poor but alive. He reached for the body where the hands with gold rings were folded on the chest. The fingers clutched the hilt of an ancient sword. A strange sight for sure. It seems that in the olden days, warriors were placed in mounds with all sorts of bling. But it's fresh. Stephen took a noisy gulp of air, and his stomach seemed to settle down. The palm of the boy's hand went down to the chest of the one who lay in the sarcophagus. It was cold. Or was it the clothes? A strange leather jacket like the ones they wore in the olden days was freezing. It's a cold night. Wait, why is a modern man dressed like that? That's for sure. The rich have their quirks. Stephen, it's silly to giggle, because his buddies will be shocked when he tells them. It's not like drawing pictures on the wall of City Hall. Who's gonna believe him, though? I'll take one ring. What does he care? Stephen muttered and grabbed the man's hand. And the next moment, Stephen suddenly met his gaze with green eyes. His heart sank, his body stiffened as much as the one lying there. And then the one lying down smiled, contrite, and sat up abruptly. Stephen's wrist was in the grip of icy fingers. Green eyes turned, and from the mouth came the hiss, or rather the warning roar of a beast ready to attack. In the next instant, Stephen wailed from staggered. He lashed out and turned and flung himself away. Rather, the bushes whipped. Spit in the face. He twisted his leg. I don't care. Just to get away. It's spurring me on. Intoxication. Stephen just flew forward. He didn't stop, even though his lungs were burning with fire. Doing what? What's following his trail? He's from a sarcophagus that flies. Maybe he's already grown wings and will crash down from above. Stephen sobs, so he sped up. And then there was the street, the police patrol, and the arrest. Apparently, he looked really bad, because at the station, before locking him behind bars, in his cell, the policeman who had inquired about his well-being gave him coffee and fed him donuts. Stephen swallowed it all and went into withdrawal. He confessed to stealing the tape recorder, and then didn't really give much credit for other things. Hooliganism, insulting authority figures, shoplifting, usually chocolate bars and potato chips. But he flatly refused to talk about why he'd been scared and what he'd asked to be rescued from. But because he didn't want to be sent to a mental institution. And then he'd probably have to tell about the diamond too. And that Stephen was a freak. It's a real mess. How many years has it been since then? And then in broad daylight, miles away from Dublin, and in a church in a place like this, he met this man. Same eyes, same nose shape. 10 years on, but Stephen would have sworn it was him. It only created more confusion in his mind, though. No, as time went on, the guy stopped thinking he'd stumbled upon a real vampire or some other ghost. That's bullshit. There's no such thing. There's got to be a rational explanation for everything. And then, over the years, this episode went, as they say, to the farthest shelf in the vault of memory. But still, now the memory is refreshed, as if it happened yesterday. And I should be glad. It turns out there was definitely a man in the crypt, but something was bothering me. It was as if seeing him was an omen. Stephen didn't realize how he'd gotten home. It's called a footstep. Before everything went wrong, he'd thought he'd be able to relax a little on his legal day off. After he gets some help at church. That's how it works, right? After that, He wouldn't go to the pub for a drink. He's been out of that for a while, ever since that day. But the pub was the best place to get the best. Chicken fried wings, perhaps. Stephen was going to have a bite of that. But now, of course, he didn't go. He lay on the bed, not developing. Stupidly did not care about the cleanliness of the house, was just lazy. But by evening and the stomach demanding sounded. And had to go to the kitchen, where he ate what piled up in the freezer instant macaroni and cheese for the microwave, and then already separated in wall in his outer clothes with pants to sleep. And what luck that there were no dreams tonight. "What are you like?" Matt asked the next day. "You'd think you were dancing with the elves all night, not sleeping, wouldn't you?" The friend grinned. Matt, like many locals, was quite serious about the little people with whom, according to Irish mythology, both elves and creatures, medium between trolls and dwarves, were related. Or maybe Matt was playing with his eyebrows. "You didn't get enough sleep, pretty girl." Stephen let the horseshoe pass not only in his ears, but also in the ears of the other bachelors at the firm. There was a perception that Matt had been pregnant again since finding personal marital bliss with the graying of his Mary's benches. "We've been doing it ever since and trying to set others on the same path. It's just been that kind of day. Listen, let's get down to business, or we won't be able to do it until New Year's Eve," Stephen replied. But it must have sounded a little rude, because Matt chirped and, grabbing the creamery materials, moved to the other end of the room. The sun was hiding behind the clouds on the seaside today, and the wind was coming in gusts. All in all, the weather was just right for hard work. "Excuse me," a ringing maiden's voice brought Stephen out of his musings. In spite of the further heavy thinking, he was distracted by the yesterday's meeting, and even smiled involuntarily. "I ordered a pizza for lunch," Tessa said, fixing her red curls that had been knocked out of her neck by the wind. "And they told me they were having a promotion and two at the same time. So maybe you boys would like some pizza too. Pizza's a good thing." Murdoch's all fired up. Oldest guy on the team. A jack of all trades, he said he'd work for another year and retire to live on the beach with his wife, devoting himself to fishing. T. O'Neill, 26, single, not in a committed relationship, orphan, but has an older brother with whom they live together. She is an interior designer by profession and calls this house her best and most important project. Loves Italian cuisine, loves to dance. Dreams of having a street Bernard. Can't stand dirty jokes. All this information Stephen didn't collect, but it was dumped on him by Matt. And Stephen had a suspicion that someone was trying to take on the role of matchmaker. Except it was no use. No, in theory, he recognized that Tessa O'Neill was a very attractive girl. They say she has natural beauty and a striking liveliness of disposition. She had waist-length red hair and freckles to match. Now in spring on the face brightness, as if opened on the forest edge, the first flowers. Tall height and slender figure with feminine forms. TLC is most often seen in dresses, flying skirts. She is so romantic. It was also known that Tessa's parents left her and her brother a decent inheritance, but she is not Matt at resorts and parties, and learned and works hard. Also supports the local animal shelter for homeless animals. Good girl. Never thought about hopping in a cab though. What the hell? They belong to different worlds, don't they? He's a loser, a 30-year-old man without a corner of his own, and with such moral baggage that if he'd lived like this 300 years ago, he would have been banished from the city gates. In general, Stephen kept his distance. Even in his mind, almost always succeeded. However, that didn't stop him from admiring, of course. Ms. O'Neill in theory. The break with pizza had a beneficial effect, and after it the work boiled over with redoubled vigor. God willing, we'll be done by next weekend, Murdoch said, arching his back. Stephen nodded. The work was really coming to an end. It was time to wallpaper and install the outlets, and then they could turn in the project and get an estimate. And Mrs. O'Neill would no longer loom before his eyes. An unhappy thought came to his brain. Stephen mentally slapped himself on the back. You're thinking about the wrong thing. It's time to settle down. Somewhere he was tired of wandering around Ireland and living in the present day. Wanted stability, wanted to put down roots. Maybe it would keep him from the pain of the past. At last it was quite evening. The workers were leaving, but Stephen was still lingering. He stood on the veranda and the second floor of the house, from which he had an impressive view of the coast. Light-colored sand, tall grasses. The wind almost always blew here, and it must be fresh here, even on the hottest day. Stephen ran his palm over the smooth, dark wood. The top of the veranda fence was made of it, and the wall of the house on this side, where the spacious living room was. There were 3 of them in the house, and they were all glass. Suddenly, an image flashed in my mind of a weekend table for the whole family in this living room. A young woman like Tessa. Of course, one day she'll have beautiful children. And her husband. He's got to be a real man. He's got to be a real man. He's got to carry her around and never hurt her. He certainly shouldn't be like me. Stephen grinned bitterly, thinking that he himself had as much chance of having a normal family as of going to the moon. Because somehow, since his youth, life had gone wrong. And what good can come from that? Today's a good day, isn't it? TPP appeared on the veranda so suddenly that Stephen flinched. She stopped a step away from him, resting her hands on the railing. The wind flew in powerful gusts and ruffled her long new skirt. A snow-white tank top was tucked beneath a cashmere cardigan, and Stephen hastily averted his gaze from the seductive forms. Got himself a freak, thought he, angrily. A girl like that would never look at someone like you. Tessa started a conversation about what remained to be done in the house, and Stephen agreed that yes, it was probably not too late to make changes to the skirting boards. But of course, that would have to be reflected in the estimate and so on. But I think I'll go, he said, glancing at his watch, as if he had somewhere to go. But he just realized he had to go. Oh, I've totally lost you guys. Tessa laughed and deftly twisted her hair into a tangle. She intercepted the silk elastic band with pearls that had been dangling from her wrist as a bracelet. The wind picked up even more. And now even the seagulls flying over the coast were noticeably flapping in its gusts. No, it's all right. Stephen smiled embarrassedly. It's just that you probably have a lot of plans for the evening. We're all about business. Well, I'm not really doing anything tonight, Tessa shrugged. My brother will be busy with our shields, and I'll probably just watch a comedy movie, suggested Stephen. No, shook her head at Tessa, and the pearl earrings on the long chain swayed in time with her movement. Melodrama. I want something about love. I see, Stephen mumbled, and for some reason got busy with the coloring. Then he decided it was time to leave. He went down to the first floor, and already at the front door, he realized that something was missing. Of course. And the toolbox is an idiot. A brand new set that had cost him almost 400 euros. Could have cost less, but it was a good set, and with a lot of useful things for a builder of repairmen who wants to work in tone with modern technology. Could have picked it up tomorrow, of course. It wouldn't have gone anywhere overnight from the house. But Stephen had a thing for keeping all his stuff with him and in neat order. So he made his way to the room where they worked. Tessa seemed to be planning to set up a guest room here tonight. Stephen, if it were his house, would have used it for a home library or nursery, because the windows looked out onto the garden. On the first floor of the house, the lights were off everywhere except the hallway. But basically the night was cloudless, and the moon was full, so there was visibility. As Stephen entered the room, he bumped into someone. And it wasn't Tessa, and the moon was just across the window, so he could see who was in front of him, and it was the one with the wine eyes, and the type. Stephen froze. The guy froze, too, and the eyes in his face became like black holes. It seemed that he was about to grin his face and let out a trumpeting animal roar. But instead, the one who stood opposite only exhaled in astonishment. You are not Yura, answered the seated voice Stephen, and paid the price. On the plus side, the fact that he had met his past at all was a plus. Now it was clear that in front of him was a living person which meant that he then did not catch a hallucination of a rebellious ancient knight. But the minus also outweighed it. This person also remembered everything, and was just furious and stepped on with a very bad look. I wonder, thought the heavies. Stephen, why is he angry? That you disturbed his peace. What the hell was going on in there? Where's the stone? A stranger from the past grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, pulling him closer. Where's my diamond? And the precious gem? Stephen, of course, remembered after the arrest, and more than once, but thought that since it was not possible to pass on, it would be better for him to keep quiet, so as not to get even more trouble. So it's yours. What is it? I don't know. I lost it. The green eyes didn't believe him. Where's the diamond? Tell me. Or what? Stephen felt an inappropriate sense of humor. I don't see a sword on you. The next moment he saw it thrown before his eyes by some dexterous trick at the door leading to the lower terrace. The blow knocked out his breath. In this part of the house it was necessary to remove the finished floor at the last moment in order to get to the wrongly laid communications. What was the other firm doing anyway? And Stephen was unlucky. Collapsed right into the hole. But lucky too, because his back hit the smooth, not the pipes. He didn't move much. No, I don't think his spine's broken. You know, it's just luck. Green eyes, and who's clearly used to solving problems with his fists, also ended up in a hole. And he's hovering over Stephen again. We were wondering what idiot the courier handed the shipment to. Couldn't find it. And then the dumbass died. Jamie's mind was moving the gloomy little man. I guess did you kill him? Green Eye's eyebrows crept upward in surprise. Why? No, he was an asshole, crossing the road where he shouldn't. He didn't have time to tell me exactly who he gave the stone to. But now I remember the face. There was no one else at the cemetery that night. So where is it? I don't know. Stephen's in my clutches and grip. I never thought of myself as a weakling, but there was nothing I could do against this type, and he suppressed not only physically, but as if he radiated energy of danger, cruelty. That's how the rival stretched out, and suddenly smiled, as if he remembered something. He looked around at the whole construction pit. And you know in the olden days that the house stood centuries, and for good luck the foundation was taken. Zamulia sacrifice, when the rooster animal what? But human sacrifice is best. So maybe since you're so useless, you've forgotten everything, so unlucky. It's worth leaving you here, you psycho, whispered Stephen. And then suddenly he learned evil and charged upward with his knee. Gotcha. Green eyes lined up, and with a lingering sideways glance the enemy collapsed. Stephen with the trot of a frog climbed out of the hole. Purely masculine. He understood that mean blow. Really painful beyond belief. What's going on here? There was a worried voice. Tessa had turned on the light in the room and now looked out onto the veranda, frowned when he saw the head of the man in the hole behind Stephen. Kirk, what are you doing there? We need to call the police. Stephen blurted out. That psycho snuck into the house and, that's my brother, exclaimed Tessa and rushed to the hole from which Zeal, obviously still in pain, was climbing out. What the hell is going on here? Stephen stood in shock. This psychopath is Tessa's brother. In general, the girl told herself a lot about him, Tala, about how kind, wonderful he was, how after the death of her parents he took care of her, and for her sake he gave up his career as a detective, took over the family business. Both that man and this one couldn't be the same person. I'm fine, Kirk muttered. And the windpipe is all over the construction dust. Tessa, who is this guy, and how did he end up in our house? Him. The girl looked at them in turn. Stephen the builder, he works here. For a few minutes there was silence around the little company. The only sounds were the sound of the surf in the distance and the singing of a bird in the garden. Yes, Patrice nods flowers. The girl exhaled. The test had taken place. Stale and masking whiskey. How about we drink tea and talk quietly about everything? Judging by Kirk's face, To speak now, he would prefer the last word over his opponent. But Stephen decided that to spite this man, who by his face and first impression would play villains in Hollywood action movies, he would keep peace for Tessa's sake. They went into the kitchen, and this room was the first to be finished and arranged as it should be. That was what the thoughtful Tessa had decided, and so now it was quite cozy. The girl piled tea, took out sandwiches and cakes from the refrigerator, put cookies on the table, and offered to have a snack. But her offer was ignored. "Boys are boys," she grinned. Take a seat between her brother and Stephen, who looked at each other without even thinking, drawn to the drinks and food. "So, what are you two fighting about?" "He stole our diamond," Kirk said flatly. "No, he didn't. I dropped it or something," shrugged Stephen. "Who stole it?" "What are you talking about?" asked Kirk. "Is it fair to pass on jewelry like that with a guy from the suburbs? Like it's something criminal?" Stephen made a logical argument. "Or am I missing something? You don't have to understand. We should have just handed over our damn diamond." Kirk stepped forward. It seemed that in a moment he would jump up on the table and throw himself at his opponent. "Maybe then we should have gone out after him, as we had agreed with the courier." Stephen raised an eyebrow expressively. "Not lying in the crypt. What was that all about? What if I had a weak heart? What's this masquerade anyway? Where's the diamond? You expect me to believe anything you say. You know, when I first asked about it, I could tell you knew what I was talking about. So you stuck your nose in what you were asked to tell me. You think it's okay to be curious. And you expect me to believe that when you saw the jewelry, you didn't run away with it." "I did." Kirk grinned. "How convenient, and there's no proof. You, by the way, tried to take the ring off me in the crypt. I'd been drinking, and I felt awfully awkward. I was drunk." "That's great. I think I'm starting to believe that a drunken idiot could actually lose what was entrusted to him. But how do you explain what?" "All right, stop. You're standing up, spreading your arms like a referee in a boxing ring. It seems we need to clear something up, and for that everyone needs to calm down." "I am calm," Kirk muttered, but sat back down and even drank his tea defiantly. Petrus spoke up, addressing Stephen. After their parents died in a car accident, it was just the two of them. She was 15, he was 18. Her father owned a large firm involved in the production and sale of automobile fuel. Kirk had hastily taken over the board of directors, although it had previously been assumed that Tracy would be the one to move into the family business because her brother had chosen a different vocation. But Tessa was still too young, and Kirk decided to postpone the dream. Relatives, of course, existed, but theoretically, because the father of the brother and sister had long ago cut all ties with most of them. The head of the family, Mr. John O'Neill, was also a passionate collector of precious and semi-precious stones. His last acquisition was a diamond from India, a unique stone of pink hue, which had a rich history and was shrouded in legends. It was not easy to get it. There was a fierce battle at the auction, and not only in the bids. There were attempts to bribe its organizers as well. John O'Neill won, but on the way, when the stone was in Istanbul, it was stolen, and it turned out that it was done by an old friend of the men's private club, Mr. Albert Free. Of course, O'Neill's lawyers were ready to take up the case, but John feared that Albert had decided to cover his tracks and hide the diamond somewhere irretrievably. Then he came upon members of a gang in Dublin, among whom were first-class thieves. They took the order and executed it brilliantly. But John did not have time to return his treasure. He and Number Kirk, who knew the whole story, had to eventually take care of the precious piece of his father's collection. The stone was to be delivered by one of the gang members, and it was Jamie. Yeah, well, the guy decided to take the case. "I see," said Stephen. "Well, he thought it was a criminal case. Turns out it was. Well, it wasn't exactly legal either, but he could understand Kirk." Now there was one more detail. What the hell was Kirk doing in the crypt? "I could say it's none of your business," Tessa's brother replied. "It's our family's." "Kirk, please. Tissa soothingly covered his hand with her fingers. I realize almost no one knew about this, but I think he can be trusted. Kirk reddened his face, threw from Papeliev an extremely suspicious glance at Stephen, but nodded silently and spoke. John O'Neill was not the kind of man who made himself. The family's wealth had been handed down from generation to generation, and almost all the ancestors in the family believed it was for a reason. According to legend, success and prosperity were granted to the first member of the family, Sturhepnu, about 500 years ago, when a brave warrior was lucky enough to capture and take Princess Mary as his wife. And since then, for each man of the O'Neill family, when the time came for him to inherit after the death of the head of the family, it was his turn to undergo a kind of initiation and test at the same time. The essence of it was that a man had to put on a gilded helmet and take a sword, and also put on rings. Both, as the legend said, belonged to the same tribe. The heir also had to put on a shroud and spend the night in the crypt. And not just any night. He had to spend it in an empty sarcophagus that was meant for him in the future. Yes, that was the tradition. When a boy was born, a sarcophagus was ordered for his future, the same size as a grown man. By the way, it was believed that it would deceive the evil forces, and in infancy, childhood, the heir would not die. Kirk grimly explained an important detail of the sinister ritual. But it is necessary not just to lie down, but to sleep. That's why they also drink a decoction of herbs. Is it a sedative and a sedative? He grinned. You know, it's a very stressful environment. Stephen listened to this almost with a high jaw. So much for aristocratic family traditions. Creepy, isn't it? I must have had too little to drink. Kirk shrugged. I had nightmares, and I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. But then when you touched me, I woke up. Scared you. Scared myself, he answered for the first time, without malice, with a chuckle. I didn't realize who you were at first. I thought maybe Tomb Raiders. Who was that figure? I saw a man in a cloak come out of the crypt, Stephen said. That's why I thought I'd come in. It was me, Tessa sighed. You were a bit of a shock, Stephen, for a 15-year-old girl to be involved in something like that. What was I supposed to do? I shrugged. We had to honor tradition, but you were alone. I'm sorry, but who would blame you if you didn't do it? No one. Tessa agreed, but we couldn't insult Father's memory. She looked fondly at Kirk. I couldn't leave my brother alone. I had to be there in case anything went wrong. Of course you did. Stephen was confused. So since he was supposed to be asleep, that's what Diamond was supposed to take him? Yes, she nodded. I was going to wait in the car, then pick up Diamond and wait for him to wake up again. But then I heard my brother's voice, and I didn't see you running away. Kirk woke up. He wasn't feeling well. We came home, called the family doctor. It seems we didn't prepare the potion correctly. Stephen thought that personally he would not have been forced by any family honor. The memory of his ancestors to sleep in a tomb and drink a potion of unknown herbs according to the recipes of ancient witches. More tea, perhaps? Tessa suggested, and without waiting for an answer, jumped up from the table behind. I was in the kitchen. So you're saying you lost the diamond? Kirk's voice combined skepticism. I would if I believed in oaths, Stephen replied. I really needed the money then, and I really thought I'd make money on the delivery. I sympathize. Kirk grinned. You were left without a diamond and without money. I know it was a lot for someone like you. Jamie must have passed the task on to someone just like you. Kirk indignantly clattered the dishes with the kettle. Kirk, Brian Neil Ono, behave himself. Kirk obeyed his sister enough to even throw a Stephen. I'm sorry, but you're partly right. The man grinned mirthfully. I needed that money badly. I thought I could get my mother into a rehab center, he added. Stephen had told almost no one about his past in recent years. It was just generalities, because what was there to tell? It's embarrassing. And that's if we don't talk about his last act, about betraying his own mother and leaving her to her fate. Suddenly Stephen spoke. Words poured out of him in a free flow. But he didn't speak in order to get sympathy. He just needed to share it all. His childhood, his youth, how his mother had left him, and how it had ended. He also told that about 6 months after he left his mother, he began to doubt the rightness of his action and decided that no, you can't leave her like that, even though drinking was, in fact, her choice. Stephen decided to go back, but when he arrived, it turned out that his mother had been moved to the hospital because her health had gotten quite bad. Hospitalized right out of the barracks. One of the homeless people sympathized and called an ambulance. Stephen rushed there and was allowed to enter the room. Since Adriana had no insurance, the hospital naturally provided the bare minimum of services. Doctors said that they managed to save the body, but the mind. In general, drunkenness and life shocks. All this led to the fact that Adriana began to go crazy, and the doctors said that according to the rules should be discharged, and further is not their business. Unfortunately, where will the patient go? Stephen was lucky to get a job on a fishing boat. Prospects were excellent, but that's if he lived alone, forgetting his mother. Now things had changed dramatically. With great difficulty, he managed to find a boarding house for the elderly, where Adriana with her diagnosis was accepted. And it cost a lot. Plus, there was a down payment for several months in advance. Stephen asked the owner of a fishing boat for help, and he agreed to lend the necessary amount. In return, however, Stephen had to work almost without a salary for about a year. He agreed. He paid for his mother, and then, when he started traveling around the country, he continued to do so. It was hard, but he kept going. The only thing he didn't have the strength for was to visit her. He had never seen her once in all those years. He still couldn't forgive her for ruining his new life through hers. She had ruined it for him too. And he was also afraid of her just reproaches. Though the doctors at that boarding house had said that Adriana had little grasp of reality. But lately the thing was that recently he had been contacted by the boarding house and told that his mother's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The doctors said to prepare for the worst, and Stephen sort of looked at himself from the outside. What kind of man is he? Is it even after so many years, and now that his mother has become quite old and helpless, he cannot let go of offenses, even if just. He could not find the strength to come closer to her, to brighten her last time with his presence, as a good son should do. Conscience was cutting, gnawing. When else would it make itself known through the years? A dull ache in once broken bones. Except Stephen couldn't cross that threshold. He couldn't not only not forgive, but agree that his mother was important in his life, not existing on its margins as an unfortunate duty, which he had to fulfill only for moral reasons. And when Stephen's story was over, when he had poured out his soul in front of these two, in fact, strangers, who had only once appeared in his life as participants in the unfortunate episode, he suddenly felt better. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Kirk sat with his arms folded across his chest, looking past Stephen to the sea outside the window. Tessa shouldered his thin fingers and looked directly at Stephen as if she intended to peer into the deepest corners of his soul. "What happened to you can't be compared to anything," Tessa said quietly. "Every person's experience is unique. But she hesitated because she obviously hurried to unite her feelings with her brother, whose opinion about the story Stephen did not yet know. "I can understand," she continued. "How does it feel to lose everything? We lost the family business, the competitors. They came in and took everything away. We went out of business and pretty much lost everything. We had to sell the family home. We couldn't keep it anymore. It turned out my father had a business loan, and the insurance was written in such a way that the insurance company refused to pay anything. We sold almost everything," Kirk added. "There's a little left, but it's crumbs compared to what it used to be. All the proceeds went into building this house. First they made the foundation. Then Tessa went to school to make it just the way she wanted it. Tessa had always wanted to live by the sea. What so many generations of our family had treasured was taken from us. But perhaps," he grinned thoughtfully, "it's for the best in a way. At least now I have a chance to do what I wanted to do. Otherwise I'd have been sitting in the big boss's office all my life." I think Tissot kicked him under the desk with his foot, because Kirk jerked and walked in, quietly sending his sister an angry look. Well, sometimes, of course, the saying goes that it wouldn't have been lucky if misfortune had helped. Stephen said, "Only the price for change is high, isn't it?" And as for me, well, I don't think my life can basically go back to normal. It just doesn't seem to be by fate. Stephen's a little miffed by that comparison. Come to think of it, they had lost everything, but had enough money to still build such a house by the sea in a resort town on the background of the fact that he was actually on the street. It certainly hurt. Plus the thought slipped in that if he hadn't gone to the crypt then, you would have taken the stone. He would have gotten the money, returned quietly by a different route, and not been captured by the police. He wouldn't have gone to jail. He could have put his mother in rehab. And the curse. His whole life could have gone right. Maybe if things hadn't gone so wrong back then. But it wasn't really Kirk's fault. It was Stephen himself who screwed it up. All right, I'll go now. Stephen rose from the table. Thanks for the tea. He smiled at Taxi. The girl got up to the sink with the dishes. Kirk rose to follow, clearly intending to walk her to the front door. I've been meaning to ask you something, Stephen said, already on the doorstep with repairs. Anyway, do you mind if I keep doing things around here? Why not? Kirk shrugged. As long as you're doing your professional duties, you're welcome to come. The words were said politely and to the point, but as if with an undertone. Stephen inwardly tensed that Kirk noticed the glances he was throwing at his sister. So they were just glances. It's clear as day that Stacy can be absolutely nothing. The next day was quite ordinary. The house was bustling with work, though she didn't show up at all. She usually stopped by every other day to see how the construction and finishing projects were going. This day everything was falling apart, but Stephen held his ground and didn't even swear when one of the workers, a young boy who was still a green trainee, accidentally dropped it on his foot. Returning home in the evening, Stephen habitually pressed the button on the phone to listen to the answering machine message. Usually there was nothing there, but now he heard an unfamiliar voice. He never hung his jacket on the coat rack. Stephen listened to him. The guy who introduced himself as Jeffrey said that they needed to meet urgently and talk. The matter is urgent. It concerns the boarding house where Stephen's mother lies. I'll be expecting you at the Gull tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Believe me, it's urgent. Stephen could not even guess who it was or what it wanted. But it seems that the mysterious Jeffrey did not belong to the staff of the boarding house. Work on the house involving Stephen's team. The next day were scheduled from 9 o'clock, so it was literally possible to get an hour off. The Seagull establishment was opened back in the 30s of the last century and served as a true gem of a marina, from which almost all 4 seasons opened pleasure boats running along the coast. Stepping inside, Stephen noticed it at once. A young fellow sitting at the farthest table, near which stands a lemon tree in a tub. On his head cap pretends to read a newspaper. Good afternoon. Stephen sits down on the seat opposite Jeffrey. Yes, he asked, and after a nod continued. I recognized him right away. It's just that those who are wearing caps now are walking around, and you are like hiding from someone. So what is it? What did you want? The waitress came over, and they both ordered a cup of coffee, so as not to sit empty-handed. Jeffrey was visibly nervous, but at the same time he gave the impression of an educated and serious young man. It turned out that a year ago his family decided to put his grandfather in the boarding house. Unfortunately, the old man was diagnosed with dementia, and he also constantly dreamed that he was being hunted by some secret agents. At first it turned out that everything was normal, and when Harry visited, he smiled, saying that everything was great, and the boarding house seemed just a resort. But then something alerted Jeffrey to this. Something was that Harry suddenly changed his delusional fantasies. Now he was saying that he and the other boarding house residents were being abused. And only on visiting days they changed him into clean clothes and told him not to complain to his relatives. And it was very strange, because the psychiatrist who had previously seen Harry said that his disease of the mind is characterized by a fixation on what has absolutely nothing to do with the surrounding reality. Grandfather said there was proof of that. Jeffrey continued with a sigh. He said that if you went to the first floor, you could go down to the basement, where they had made a punishment cell for the naughty ones. I decided to check it out. And when I left, I pretended I'd forgotten something in Grandpa's room and walked on unnoticed. I found the stairs to the basement. The door was unlocked, and there was a light on downstairs. There was indeed a room and a door with a window. I looked in and saw 2 orderlies tying up an old lady. It wasn't the kind of room where, they can lock up a violent patient for a while. It was just a hole with a cement floor walls. It was cold, damp. This poor woman was sitting on the floor in her nightgown. Her hands were shackled, seen shackled in museums. Could it be the same thing? I managed to make a short video. I managed to get up and pretend it never happened. I went to my lawyer, and he believed me. I was lucky. He said another man had approached him with the same complaints. His relative had given up a lot. His health got worse in that boarding house, and the lawyer said it was serious. The owner of the boarding house is a powerful, respected member of the community. The police would need a good reason, apart from the complaints of the old people and the videotape, which they would check if it was taken from a horror movie or a fake. And so I decided to contact other people whose relatives are in that boarding house and see if they noticed anything strange in the behavior or condition of their relatives. Maybe if we teamed up, we could make it work. Stephen listened to Jeffrey without interrupting, and he believed him from the first word because his gut told him the guy wasn't lying. But there was something else that was dark, something that was bothering me. This woman you saw, Stephen asked in a hushed voice. What did she look like? Seemed very petite, Jeffrey said. Gray hair, cut short. It was dark in there, but I'd better show you. He hurriedly pulled out a smartphone and handed it to Stephen. That's my mother, Stephen said, barely seeing the video. But it took his breath away. I haven't seen her in a very long time. I've only been told she's doing well. That's my mother. I'm going to get her. He raised his voice so high and jumped up so sharply, almost knocking over a table, that other visitors to the Gull encroached on them. It's not that simple. Jeffrey shook his head. Did you read the contract to discharge the patient? His condition is mental and physical. A special committee must first determine. This is to protect the boarding house from possible claims. Suddenly, one of the old people will become ill due to the negligence of relatives when they have already taken the guest. And so there will be evidence that the deterioration is not the boarding house's fault. So it'll take about a week. Are you already taking the grandfather? Stephen asked. Yes, Jeffrey nodded. I've applied. I don't care. Stephen exhaled. I'm not going to wait for her to be bullied any longer. I'm going right now. Only it was much easier to say than to do. The bus to get to the village, near which the boarding house was located, left only late at night, and there was no money for a cab because Stephen had not been spending his budget very carefully lately. The advance wasn't due until the day after tomorrow. On top of that, the phone was ringing off the hook. The foreman demanded that Stephen report to the site immediately or he would be fired. I had to comply. And besides, Stephen decided he'd try to get some cab fare from Matt or Murdoch, for instance. But when he got to the house, neither was there. The first had taken time off work because a child had fallen down the slide and had been taken to hospital with a suspected fracture. And the second went to scandalize the supplier of coffee tiles for the fact that, despite 100 clarifications, sent the wrong shade. So we'll have to wait. Everything okay? Asked Kirk, who was in the house that day to sign a couple of papers to accept the delivery of the next final stage of work. Yes, nodded Stephen. Yesterday's state of mind, when he was pouring his soul out, was far behind him. But it wasn't completely silent either. You're not wearing a face, Kirk snorted. Is it something with your mother? Yes, Stephen blurted out. I have to leave immediately. And he outlined the current situation in a few sentences. You're talking. The lawyer's name is Archibald Stone. I know the guy. He and I go sailing sometimes. We've known each other since high school, Kirk said. He said he's working on a case right now involving some big shot. I sympathize with you, but how are you going to pull this off? Do you want to just barge in and take her? Why not? Stephen's fists were itching, as they say, and his thoughts were racing frantically. I'm afraid those words were not easy to say, but they had to be said. I'm afraid I won't make it, Mom, if anything happens to her. I'm sorry. I must be distracting myself from the really important things, Stephen said with a bitter chuckle, because Kirk was suddenly distracted by his cell phone, apparently texting someone. So I guess this is what we'll do, he muttered. We leave in half an hour. What? Stephen rounded up, eyes at a loss. Are you going with me? I think Dennis alone. Can you manage? He smiled at Sill's eyes. And I brought someone with me. So I think there's going to be a problem. Yeah, that's probably it, sighed Stephen. Not us, them. Kirk patted him on the shoulder. And it came out so unexpectedly reassuring and friendly, almost brotherly, that Stephen's heart warmed. Stephen had thought the foreman would grumble, perhaps threaten to quit. But when Kirk had said a word or two, he let him go easily. I told him that I was paying for the construction, so I had the right to take you away for a while if I really needed to, on personal business. And I said that if he didn't have time to do something because of that, I wouldn't make any claims, and I'd pay for an extra day for the crew to finish everything. Cleared Zelina's situation. The eye cut out onto the suburban highway. The car was driving at the maximum allowable speed, and taking into account that the highway was busy, Stephen was forced to admit. Great driver. Almost all the way past in silence, and when they arrived, at the gate of the boarding house territory, they were met by another car, from which came out some very formidable-looking shaven-headed type in a black leather jacket. Who is it? Stephen asked bluntly, because he didn't quite know what was going on. An acquaintance, carelessly clarified Kirk, clearly not wanting to go into detail. Let's say, although the firm is gone, but there are still some old connections. He was silent for a while, and while they were waiting for the guard to come out of the gate, he continued. In general, if we tried hard, we could keep the firm 10% to success. Theoretically there was, but Tessa wasn't ready to shoulder the load. And it's not that I chickened out, but my father always said if you're not sure about something, you shouldn't do it. We saved what we could. And I think we're on the right track now. The guard who came out said glumly that today was not a day for visiting guests, which means they need one. We need to see the director of the whole place, about his skinny-headed type. Look, you're not a security guard. I was about to object, but the skinheads did. Leaned over to him, whispered something in his ear, and the guard's face stretched. His face turned pale. Why didn't you say so in the first place? Almost. He shouted in a frightened voice and opened the gate, clearing the way. What did he say to him? Stephen inquired. He hinted that if we weren't allowed in, Mr. Jonathan Green would be very unhappy. That say, many people believe that he has something to do with our Irish mafia and that his name is on the rumor. And that it's true. Stephen was not at all smiling at having anything to do with the mafia. That's not exactly what people say, Kirk grinned. But Jonathan Gray was once my father's golf club partner. He nodded at the leather-jacketed man. His stepson Peter, who we shared a sandbox with. Nice to meet you. A pleasure. Peter asked menacingly without looking at Stephen. But if you have such acquaintances, why didn't you defend your father's inheritance? Stephen still could not see the logic in the actions of his brother and sister. I've already explained, Kirk answered sighingly but patiently. Father himself would have done the same thing if one day he could no longer manage the business properly. We would have brought the firm down and ruined all the reputation our family had built up. This way we kept the family honor and a few % of the stock. The cars stopped in the parking lot of the boarding house, and now there was no time to talk. Stephen could barely keep from breaking into a run. The guard, glancing at the small company, subserviently escorted them to the director's office, And now Stephen realistically barely restrained himself from just punching her with his fist, or preferably two. On the cold round face of the director with the connivance, or maybe with the instructions of which defenseless old people were treated so disgustingly. Unlike the guard, the headmaster was not so accommodating, and even the mention of the powerful Mr. Gray did not seem to affect him at first. However, he was still nervous, twirling the pen in his fingers. His eyes were racing. I swear, no one has ever complained about our establishment before. Finally, in desperation, he declared, "We treat all old people as our own kin. And besides, pardon me, but the headmaster gave Kirk a hard look. Do we have any of your relatives, sir?" "No, fortunately not." Kirk grinned wickedly. "I wouldn't trust you with an old rat, sir. And as for complaints, personally, since I have had no dealings with you, I will make no complaint." But when his palms hit the countertops, he jerked forward, nearly smashing his forehead into Nolito. The nervous beauty of the headmaster's face. But it would be sad if I witnessed my friend being denied his legal right to take his own mother. Wouldn't it? There's more to it than just the rules in your contract, right? And legally, you have no right to keep her. Isn't that right? I see you're well aware of that. The director's tone was more accommodating and almost visionary. Of course, I have now arranged for the mother of this esteemed Mr. Stephen to be helped to pack. Don't bother, snorted Kirk. You will escort him to her now. The headmaster reached again to loosen the knot of his tie with half a finger and nodded. One more thing, Stephen added boldly, and following Kirkorov's example, moved toward the director. Do you have another old man? Stephen's heart was allowed in this okay, which stopped. He walked down the corridor and pondered what to say to her. First of all, to apologize, to promise that he would not leave her again. But now they were in front of the ward. A nurse in a strict gray dress, who looked terribly displeased and but had to obey, opened the lock of the door, and it fell away. Adriana sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window. Or rather, at the window, because it was closed with the blinds down. How had she aged? Stephen thought. Is it really her, mother? Quietly, he called out. Adriana slowly turned her head. At first he thought it was too late, but the expression on her face had changed. And the main thing was not even the smile on her pale lips, but the way her eyes lit up in a flash. Stephen on the verge of hearing. She dropped the word son. I'm awake. No, Mom. Stephen, unashamed of the tears in his eyes, stepped toward her. A moment later, he knelt down in front of the bed. He plunged into the warm embrace of his mother's arms, just as he had done long ago, when he was a child. Mom, I'm back. I brought you back. Kirk and Peter froze on the doorstep, and then tactfully stepped out behind him and covered the door, so as not to interfere with the intimacy of two people finally dooming each other. However, it was still almost 2:00 before they could all leave the boarding house. The reason for the delay was Harry, who at first got scared, thinking that he had done something wrong and would be taken to the SAU for it. Then he said that secret agents from London were waiting to capture him and bring him to the Tower to be tried by the Virgin Queen. The old man was so stubborn that Stephen finally decided on a highly atypical act. He said he had personally witnessed Harry's grandson deal coolly with a couple of such agents, and then took a written promise from them that they would leave Harry alone. And the scroll was secured with the Queen's ring. On a wave of creative imagination finished Stephen. True raised bones and eyebrows that resembled Harry's snow-white caterpillars. And what was depicted on the seal? May I ask, Lilia? Assumed Stephen, belatedly remembering that it was a symbol of sorts from the French monarchy. Aha! Harry grinned and clapped his hands together. I knew Louis had something to do with this. Well, in that case, I'm calm. So what are we standing here for? Come on, let's go. And then, when they were already down on the porch, Harry turned toward the boarding house, picked up a pebble from the ground, and swung it at his neck. Sent it flying all the way to the window of the headmaster's office. Cool, sincerely admired Stephen. Let's go quickly, he hurried everyone. But how did you do it? Geoffrey, whom Stephen had telephoned to say that Harry would be waiting for him at the Gull, was shocked when he heard what had happened. "I'm not." Stephen shrugged his shoulders. "Was that it?" "Him." He nodded at Kirk, who was clearly uncomfortable with being grabbed. And now he rolled his eyes and muttered that please stop talking about it, since the case was already done. "I was at the lawyer's office," Jeffrey told me excitedly. "He said the paperwork was finally ready. The last time I talked to him was a week ago, and he really seems to know how to work. So we're going home now." "What about the family?" Stephen asked. "Won't they want to send Harry to the orphanage again? Or will you look for a good place this time?" "I actually thought it would be best for him," sighed Jeffrey. "I think I'll take a vacation from work for a while. I'm a photographer for a magazine, and basically they can do without me for a bit. There's someone to replace me. I think I can look after Grandpa for a while, and then I'll think about it. But I certainly don't trust him to anyone else." The hero of the discussion was sitting there, and the varnish was chocolate for the money. The whole company occupied a large table, so there was enough room for everyone. Adriana just sat and looked through the window at the sea, over which seagulls were flying. It had been a long day. Stephen himself had to make up his mind. After all, he lived in a tiny apartment and could not imagine how he would be able to combine work and taking care of his mother, who still had a little bit, but had problems with consciousness. But once again, Kirk surprised him by saying that it was possible to hire a good nurse for Stephen's mother, or even better to work in shifts. And for comfortable living, of course, it would be better to move into a 2-room apartment. And then, of course, Adriana should be examined as soon as possible and as fully as possible to determine the necessary treatment for her. Unfortunately, Kirk noted, there was a strong possibility that she would still need constant medication and medical supervision. "Thanks for the advice," Stephen sighed. "But I don't think I can afford all that. I'll keep it simple, brief, and even a little strict," Kirk said. "No objections," he added. An emotion of shock and amazement came over Stephen's face. "I can help with that," Jeffrey said. "You got my grandfather out of there. I owe you a debt of gratitude." Stephen was confused. "What do you mean, essentially strangers?" "Yeah, they were both very wealthy, but it's still an offer of help. I don't know what to say." He expressed his feelings honestly. "I just did." "Thank you. I will." "There's no need to say anything," Kirk said. "Better just do it, and do it soon," he added, nodding at Harry, who was flirtatiously informing a passing young waitress that he could show her around the world because he had secret agents as friends. The next few days, or rather weeks, passed in incredible bustle. They seemed to stretch on like an eternity, and yet they flew by so quickly. Stephen's mother and he were settled in an apartment downtown, with attentive professional caregivers to help manage everything. Kirk helped Stephen negotiate an emergency vacation at work. Jeffrey kept him in the loop. The director of the boarding house and his assistants had finally been charged appropriately, and all the elderly wards had finally been taken care of. The renovation of the house, by the way, was finally completed, and one day Tessa said that she wanted to meet Stephen, that they needed to talk. At first it was about how nice the house was, and how glad Tessa was that Stephen was doing so well with his mother. And then somehow Stephen asked Tessa out on a date. She froze, frozen, with only her long pearl earrings swaying. "And here I thought you'd never go for it." Suddenly she laughed. "And I'll have to do it all myself." "You mean ask you out on dates? That wouldn't be so romantic." He was amazed that she'd been looking at him for a long time, and now he could breathe a sigh of relief that the date had gone well. And then, yes, Stephen still mentally returned to his doubts that he was not a match for Odessa, and even thought with trepidation about how soon the relationship would undoubtedly have to be severed. "We should talk," Kirk said. Stephen was at his and Tessa's house at the time. She had recommended him as a good repairman to several of her friends and had called him over to discuss details of future work and to give him a couple of tips on future clients. These friends, as Stephen realized, were very rich people and he thus had the opportunity to build up a large client base so that he could leave the firm and work as a private master. Or maybe you could start your own company one day, Tessa told him. And it was clear she wasn't kidding. Good, agreed Stephen with a pick. The men stood on the veranda, the sun slanting over the horizon. Seagulls flew over the water. I didn't tell you this, Kirk said with a sigh. But my sister hopes you'll propose to her soon. Yeah, Stephen gasped with excitement. He had thought about it, but it seemed like an unrealistic dream. I've thought about it, he admitted. Good, Kirk nodded. Because I'm not going to let anyone play with my namesake. I don't know what she sees in you, but I respect her choice. Kirk's hand came down on Stephen's shoulder. The fingers squeezed made her happy. I believe in you. I'm giving you a chance. But remember, if you see my sister, I'll send you to the other world with my own hands. Stephen smiled. He had no doubt that he loved his namesake and that he would do anything to make her happy. Subscribe and click the bell. The clear, starry sky was immediately covered by clouds, the patriarch's plane. But he was confidently landing through the porthole. It was raining behind the drum. From the liner to the bus, passengers ran, covered themselves with a jacket and BP squares. The station was warm and cozy. Adriana ordered at the buffet a coffee, smoky, flavorful drink, finally warmed her for the phone came running. Hello, I'm just passing through in Street Petersburg. Remember me? The low male voice. Yes, it greatly excited the woman. So much so that every fiber of her being trembled. Charles, it's you. The man interrupted her impatiently. I want to see you now. And don't say it's impossible. I won't, Adriana replied, not hiding her joy. Come to my place. I'll take a cab, and in about 40 minutes I'll be home. I just flew back from Antalya on vacation. Is that what it means? I'm in luck. I'm on my way. And he hung up. Charles Somov. First love, the only unforgettable one. The one everyone in the group drooled over. Such a handsome gray mouse, and Adriana. He is Russian, big and light russet with clear gray eyes. She is a Tatar stubby with a short boyish haircut, green eyes, and bright red hair. Charles was a tidbit for all the female students, looked back at him still and the center, as they said then, with unquestionable authority, a born leader, a little wordy, confident rural nugget, that he had graduated brilliantly from high school. He mastered several martial arts, so all the majors in the group respectfully greeted him, and his word was weighty. He said it like he said it. There was no one willing to argue. Why he could not breathe on the vogue guessed all around the girls with lush forms a lot. And he and his father, the fugitives, were the only ones who didn't talk about their affair. Here's a mystery. Their romance was stormy, but fleeting outbreak of wild passions. Unbridled happiness lasted until one day he met her friend, big-eyed and blonde, graceful and romantic. In his third year, everyone gasped. After learning that Charles had married someone else, he began taking his girlfriend to student parties. When he saw her, he smiled and acted as if nothing had ever happened between them. Betty, on the contrary, immediately lowered her eyes and tried not to face her former friend. They had their own lives. But Charles emphasized that he was ready to communicate with Adriana on a friendly basis. Therefore, they did not lose sight of each other, and at the end of the university often called, and then moved to written messages in social networks. Throughout the years, the man kept in touch with Adriana. Communication was of an innocent nature. Not a word about former feelings and relationships. However, she always felt that Charles never forgot their hot love, and Adriana saw him a couple of years ago at a reunion. He gave the impression of a successful and quite happy man. He was an accomplished scientist. He had a PhD, worked at the most prestigious university in the capital, boasted about his family, his son's success, and the recognition of his wife's work at local exhibitions. Betty drew from childhood at the level of an amateur, but very well. So she was surprised at his desire to meet, having no idea why he wanted to meet. The cab rushed her through the night city, the lights of the houses flickering in the window, old Italian compositions blaring through the cabin. Soon she was already taking the elevator. There was the door of her apartment. Adriana entered, and the first thing she did was to kick off her cramped shoes. In a minute, she stuck a chicken in the oven, her duty dish she had bought at the night supermarket near her home, and went to take a shower. By the time the chicken started to blush, Charles, Adriana, showed up. With a towel on her head and a white robe, opened the door. She didn't put on makeup, put on her makeup. That's the way they used to do it. They presented each other as they were. They weren't shy. Here he is her chosen one with a stylish coat, black color. Underneath is a business suit from some official event. As always, handsome and charming, in his hands a bouquet of delicate lilies. So he has not forgotten how she loves them. And the champagne Brut bottle remembers it too. He's older, he's gotten better, but he's just as charismatic and bright. Already a professor, he walked confidently into the apartment as if he was here every day. He smiled broadly, kissed Adriana on the cheek and said, "You haven't changed." And they both laughed. The awkwardness of the first few minutes had passed. Exchanging common phrases, they settled in the kitchen. Teasing the aromas behind the chicken cookies brought Adriana out of her romantic state. She turned off the oven and prepared to unnerve the table. "Let's sit here," Charles suggested. "It's cozy." They did so while the man opened the champagne. The hostess, with honed movements, spread fresh salad leaves on a plate, and in the middle placed a sealed dish evenly, covered with a golden crust on cut thin halves, rings, cucumbers, peppers, large tomatoes, and celery. They landed at the kitchen table. Charles filled a flute with champagne and disappeared. The white cap settled quickly, and the man made a toast to you and me, to those reckless and enthusiastic students from that time, from the past, to youth and the heat of relationships. Wow. The toast even made me raise my green, witchy eyes at Charles, downright nostalgic. Why would that be? What's wrong with the family at all? Charles looked away silently, nervously rubbing the napkin in his hand. "How can I tell you? As it is," the woman insisted, "I can't keep anything from you." The guest sighed tiredly. They were silent for a moment, and then they started on the chicken. I saw how difficult it was for Charles to start the conversation for which he had come, but the woman was patient and waited. Finally, he began. "You probably never forgave me for marrying Betty. What made you think so? And I haven't expressed any dissatisfaction to you since we broke up. Oh, come on. You've always been very reserved and not very emotional in public. The only time you ever cried was when you were alone with me." "Yeah," he lowered his head. "When we were together, you opened up to me completely, and I was delighted to dive into your joys and sorrows. Enjoyed smiling at your smiling but wonderfully open face or wiping tears from your marvelous eyes. Well, then I became a stranger to you, and you acted like a friend. That's very noble of you, but I still think it was very unpleasant in your heart. Charles, don't be absurd. I let you go where you wanted to go. You know I don't hold anyone by force. My 2 marriages and divorces are proof of that. There's pigeons walking around too. Once the ring is free, I don't dwell on it, I move on. And you've always been the center of attention. All the classmates respected you and loved you. And the girls were sick. I knew you only had to look at me with one interested glance, and all the students would jump into your arms. Adriana was content to have you all to herself. Tell me, how do you and Betty live now? We're well off. My son's all grown up, studying to be a decorator in St. Petersburg. He's all on his own. I told you about it at the meeting. But in general, our life is measured, settled, but boring. There's no sensuality in it." I interrupted him. "Is that why you came to me? To shake things up, so to speak? I'm not gonna hide the redhead you're against." He took a volley into his champagne glass and raised his eyes hopefully to the woman. Adriana took his hand in hers and felt the palm of her hand wet. Charles' embarrassment on his forehead appeared vaporized. Are you sure about this decision of yours? Yes, sweetheart. I only want to be with you. And Adriana shuddered. Lightning flashed outside the window. Thunder rumbled through the sky. The rain came down with renewed vigor. She smiled and headed toward the bedroom. Charles followed her, threw off her robe, toweled off, shook out her red hair, and threw a proud look at her favorite man. Looked still slim and pretty. Charles rushed to her voluptuous embrace. Hot kisses, furious moans, crazy passions rode between them again. Tired, happy, they fell asleep at first light. In the morning, she saw Somovov on the train. He stood at the car window and sent her air kisses. Once again, he would leave her, going home to Betty, with her charming blue eyes and girl. Adriana met in the fall before she started uni. She was suffering a lot from loneliness then, renting an apartment on the outskirts of the city near a small, quiet square. Her parents brought her, and she fled back to Kazan, the city of her childhood. Adriana was very bored. She was used to living surrounded by numerous relatives and friends, noisy and breadwinning Oriental festivals. She had grown up in the private sector, which made her apartment a bit creepy. Closed space pressed on the brain-dark walls and low ceilings, so the girl tried to spend as much time as possible outside. That's when, in the courtyard surrounded by standard high-rise buildings, she watched the residents, some of them passers-by. From the sidewalks back and forth discussed political and economic topics. Some of them were walking their dogs, others were gossiping about the evil of the day. Evening darkness thickened, descending on the city. The nearby railroad station hummed with the noise of trains and the voices of dispatchers. The windows of the houses exploded with cozy light. Betty walked into the courtyard from the street, stopped outside her entryway. Don't you know, that student doesn't rent apartments. She turned to her. The lantern light fell on the stranger's face, and Adriana could make her out. But a pure angel in a softly lilac jacket, golden curls on her tan shoulders. A smile. It's sad and concerned. And what institution will you study at? In the Pedagogical University at Inyas. Yes. And in what group? In 712, said the girl, and I'm in it. Adriana got up from the bench. What a coincidence. I'm renting from a city girl. Come on, I'll show you the apartment. It sleeps too. The landlady said she wouldn't mind if I recommended someone. She did. That's lucky. I had an arrangement with the apartment. I was renting when I got here, but all of a sudden the woman changed her mind and told me to look for a new place, like her daughter's moving in with her. Do you live apart from your daughter? Yes, she lives in the private sector on the outskirts. She only comes for money and inspections. She's a nice old woman who asks only to keep the place clean, pay on time, and not to organize noisy parties. We'll go up there and you'll see for yourself. Where's your stuff? In the locker at the station. Okay, if you stay, we'll pick them up in the morning. In the elevator, the girls went up to the 9th floor, examined the room and the kitchen. Well, it is quite possible to live together, said the guest. It's settled then. What's your name? Betty. For you. I'm Adriana. Wow, what a beautiful foreign name. No, it's a mix of Tatar and Greek. But we'll get to know each other, smiled the blonde. Even at night, they moved to the train station, which was close, creating a characteristic noise background, the clatter of train wheels, the hum of human voices, picked up their things from the luggage room and the road and back. Got close in a couple of hours, went and drunk, told each other about their lives. They didn't even notice how the sun rose over the northern capital. Together, they were warm and happy. Since that time, the girls practically never parted. They studied and lived together. They prepared for classes, took walks and went shopping. They were comfortable in everyday life. Adriana adored cleanliness, so cleaning was part of her duties. Betty was a great cook and loved to experiment with food. Behind her was the kitchen. And the girl also had a hobby. She loved to draw. And Fig loved to follow when inspired and lightly touched canvas or paper with her brush. Landscapes and still lifes turned out bright, positive, and slightly naive, as if children. It was not surprising. After all, the girl herself was very sincere and kind. Adriana became firmly attached to her, as she knew how to listen and sympathize with no one before. She talked a lot, told about everything, shared her innermost things, and Adriana kept these secrets. The girl was glad that she managed to meet a man who colored her urban loneliness and became a support in everything. Winter evenings dived into warm plaids. The girls sat on the couch by the TV and watched soap operas, then hotly discussed the deeds of the heroes, defending traditional human values, condemning lies, deceit, betrayal, and praising love and beauty. And one day everything changed suddenly in a couple of hours. The unity of friendly hearts began to come apart at the seams. For Adriana was noticed by the most prominent guy on the course, and she began to come to the apartment home. Not like she used to. Now her hands were clasped beautiful bouquets, and there was a glint in her eyes, a love. After a while, Adriana started talking about moving. Betty grew sad, started having conversations about how she had no more room in her friend's soul, nowhere and nowhere near her. Said she felt like a shadow that she wasn't paying attention to. "I'll go away," she said in the heat of the moment, back to where she came from. And then he introduced her to Charles, to her own misfortune. She ruined a captivating happiness with her own hands. They saw each other in the study group, of course, but only exchanged greetings. "Well, Charles, look how we live here." The girl spun around the small apartment. Betty said hello to the boy, showing her displeasure at his arrival in the kitchen. Adriana asked him, "How did you like my friend?" "She's fine, just grumpy. You know what she said about you, no offense." "Okay. She said you're too businesslike and reserved for me." "That's funny, isn't it? It's me, you're reserved." "Yeah, I'm ready to love you every minute of the day." She just sees the world through rose-colored glasses. Such a romantic madam. Charles laughed. "Well, yes, she is a little." He agreed. "She's an artist. Is she a good painter, or does she paint like that?" "No, she's an amazing painter. You can show her work. Why are you so interested all of a sudden?" "I didn't realize you were a fan of the painting business. I'm just curious." "She has a boyfriend." "Why do you want to know why?" "I'm just wondering if being alone makes her angry." "She's not mean. She's a good girl. It's just that we've always been friends, and now you're here." She feels abandoned, neglected. "Well, that's ridiculous. What kind of male jealousy is that?" "Well, it happens among ladies," said Adriana, kissing her lover on the cheek. "I do not understand, and I will not argue. Apparently, the authority of the best friend is unshakable. I'll try to be nice to her. Maybe she'll let it go." He playfully slapped the girl just below her back and went into the room. Adriana, peeking in their direction from time to time, seeing Betty showing him her drawings, smiled contentedly. But it was all business. Charles, anybody would be charmed by him. Tomorrow she'll be babbling about him with admiration. "Hey, lovebirds, there's no tearing you away from each other." She was joking. "Everything's ready for tea. Come quickly." At the table, Adriana noticed that Betty's gaze had softened, and she looked at her guest with sympathy. And Charles behaved impeccably, courteous to both of them. A couple of days later, Adriana fell ill, and he rushed over to check on her. Brought her groceries from the supermarket, bought her medication. "Now you go to a party alone, and you're left without a woman's supervision," she lamented. Wraps a scarf around her throat. "Afraid for my honor." The boy grinned. "Or some hottie will catch it, and you'll be dead." "I could go," she interjected. "Betty, you both whistled before the girl, and Poppy was not to lure you to noisy corporate parties, so the equator got embarrassed." She was well pleased, he was. "You were looking out for Charles back then, and he was looking out for you." Adriana was tired of throwing herself on the pillows and soon fell asleep. "Come on, go get ready and I'll meet you there." Betty carefully prepared for the trip. She showered, styled her hair, and picked out her best dress. She put on bright makeup. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She changed from a sweet, gentle girl into an exotic beauty. The girl did not like noisy festivals, where there was a lot of eating, drinking, singing songs, and dancing. She was not interested. And this time, at the corporate party, she was a little late. During this time, her classmates had time to take a good dose of alcohol on their chests. Young people with red faces were running around the room, organized the party by the head teacher in her apartment, all jumping, squealing in a word, fooling around like children. Charles, seeing Betty, went up to her. "How beautiful are you today?" He smiled. "Thanks for noticing." Charles shrugged his shoulders. It was hard for him to understand the girl's soul. When you meet a girl, you don't know what to expect from her in the next second. Not even from girls you don't know. "Now you've given me a clumsy compliment. I guess you're offended. Let's have a glass of champagne, if I may, right away." Charles came back a couple of minutes later. Yes, he was very handsome indeed. Stately, confident, smiling, agile. Betty was suddenly afraid that she had been thinking of him constantly, ever since his appearance at the rented apartment. She pushed those intrusive thoughts away, but in vain. Charles poured the girl more alcohol than he had deliberately poured himself. Let her relax. She drank it in one gulp. Worried at the new surroundings, she asked for more. After the second drink, the tension eased, and the girl cheered up. Charles noticed that she was very seductive. He brought more champagne and suggested that the two of them settle down on the couch. Just as all the students had gone dancing, and there was plenty of room to spare, she agreed. "What shall we drink to?" asked the guy. "And to you." Betty smiled. "Don't toast to you. You look amazing tonight." Guys, all eyes broke. "I know. Be great. You're beautiful." And now Charles blushed. The girl looked at him in a way that made the guy's blood run cold. Yeah, best friends. It's a dangerous test of a relationship, he thought. They have a very similar outlook on life. Your chosen one understands you as quickly as she does. Accordingly, they'll like you sooner or later. But the appearance of another body, still unrecognized. In general, the temptation is still that, whether it will be right to call her and ask her out. Is she playing with me or is she into me too? The only way to find out is to see if she is. He dialed Betty's number the next day, the day before, and entered it into his phone. "Hi," he said into the phone. "How are you?" "Great." She answered with joy in her voice. "I'm calling because I want to see you." "It's a date." The girl was confused. "Right. You want to talk about Adriana?" "No. I want to be alone with you. But we'll sit in a cafe. We'll talk. We'll drink champagne. Where's Maxim's tomorrow?" The 18 o'clock. I saw a restaurant in the semi-basement, behind the department store on the left, just around the corner. Betty arrived without being late. I think she was starting to wake up into a real woman. That's why she looked stunning in a short white dress and coffee-colored leather booties, on top of an inexpensive rabbit fur coat. But it was very much to the girl's face. "Where are the people?" she asked, looking around the empty hall. Charles got up and helped her take off her coat. That slipped from her bare shoulders' deep cleavage, touching the soft silk of her skin. It all excited the guy. "The flow of people subsides after 6, he answered in Osipov's voice. Strange usually, on the contrary, in such establishments by night more and more. "Well, what did you want to tell me?" "Have a seat." Charles filled the glasses. Betty sat down across from him. They drank afterward. They talked leisurely about the weather, their studies, and mutual acquaintances. They quickly found a rapport. What a nice champagne. The girl admired it. Such a light and pleasant intoxication. Betty, careful how you start, Charles. I was endlessly in love with redheads until I got close to you. Are we close? Betty wondered. Not as close as I'd like to be, the boy mused. But I recognized you and disappeared. What are you gonna tell her? I don't know, to be honest. But you agree to go out with me? Yeah. Betty easily betrayed her friend at that moment because she was madly in love with Charles. The same night, he took Betty to his rented apartment, and they spent the whole weekend in the heat of bedlam. It seemed to Charles then that this intimacy was unlike anything else. The desire for physical love was inexhaustible, and the girl was pure and affectionate. Even in the morning, they could not tear themselves away from each other. A beautiful spring rain caught them outside. It was welcoming and short. They laughed and kissed. From that day on, the lovers never parted for a single day. Charles and Betty were looking forward to their dates. They planned where and when they would see each other and how much time they would spend alone together. Charles was in a kind of frenzy. When he was with Adriana, he thought of Betty. When he was with her, he couldn't shake the guilt he felt for the Adriana he once loved. Betty was tormented too. It was hard for her to admit what she had done to her friend. "It's so mean," she said, lying in her lover's arms. "I'll tell her soon. Trust me," he replied, savoring his cognac. But they couldn't give up their meetings. Neither of them wanted to cheat and betray. But still the couple did it every day. The secret meetings lasted 6 months. And then, one day, returning to the apartment, Betty found her friend in tears. "What happened?" she asked, already guessing the answer. Adriana continued quietly. The sobs made Betty uncomfortable. "That you're tearing up as if someone had died. It is that you've lost someone. Charles is cheating on me. It's like I'm dead myself. Lost in life. I've lost my meaning. And most importantly, he doesn't say who." She apologized with tears in her eyes for so long. "But I couldn't hear it. Suggested we stay friends and start a new life. My God, how shameful for a girl's soul. How impossible it is to open everything to her." PG reached out to her and became like a sister, and she pushed away her own person. Fate has sent her help in her person, probably for the first time in her life after she lost her brother. Betty went to the window and stood there, remembering the past. He had been found in the basement under the house. The 17-year-old handsome blonde boy had been there for 24 hours. The village started talking about it being a murder, but there was no hint of a crime. Betty Cathy's mother never recovered from the tragedy. As they say, she was fooled. She got involved in crime and never raised her 15-year-old daughter. Since that time, Betty was literally orphaned. Her mother came home rarely and always in dubious company. She would cast an unkind glance at her daughter and go into her bedroom with her beau. There they spent nights drinking and debauchery. Betty could not stand it and ran away to her grandmother, an old woman, her father's mother. He died young on a military exercise just after the army. Something happened in the tank, and it caught fire with the crew. Christina's grandmother was the custodian of the allowance that both children received after his death. Cathy brought in all the funds to her, and she did the saving. It was only in recent years that Cathy stopped following the former arrangement and punched everything in. The grandmother really did not want Tojic, as she called her, to be taken to the orphanage, so she helped her granddaughter in every possible way, fed her, and gave her some money. For the same reason, and did not write us to the guardianship department. Drawing became a spiritual salvation for the girl. It helped her to leave the terrible reality and immerse herself in the beautiful world of painting. Teachers at school praised her for her unusual drawings, attracted her to thematic competitions, advised her to study to become a professional artist. So she and her mother lived together and apart at the same time. However, Betty felt sorry for her mother, thinking that her son's death had broken her. But one day she had to hear such a thing. What made the hair on her head stir? That day the girl went to town to the market. Her grandmother told her to bring medicine for her. Betty visited the pharmacy and was just getting ready to go to the train station, as she saw a lanky figure, carelessly dressed in worn jeans, a jacket not the first freshness, and salty sneakers, once blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, greasy hair falling over her eyes. She recognized her mother and motioned for her to follow. Cathy stopped in the courthouse hallway, a statuesque, beautiful woman. With an abrupt motion, her mother pulled a bottle of vodka and 2 clean disposable cups from her jeans pocket and demanded, "Let's have a drink. We went to the same school. Remember me?" "We did," she nodded. But the smell of vodka made him squeamish. "Is it good that you remember?" "Sorry about the vodka. I couldn't say it dry. It's hard for me. You can't tell me what a load I've put everything under." "No, it's not mine to poke at them. It's just a kind of familiarity and reason. So I dared to pour out my torment to you at last. What's keeping me from living? I'm both ashamed and afraid." She again snatched the bottle to take a sip and straight from the neck lowered her voice and began in a flat. "Remember, the young man was murdered, and the murderer was never found. Remember?" Her interlocutor nodded. "It was me." She pounded her chest. Betty felt goosebumps creep up the back of her neck. She took a deep breath and pulled herself together. "I was holding a frying pan. When he told me that I was to blame for his father's death, that I had driven him crazy, he had gone to the unit in a bad state of mind and ruined himself and his comrades. I hit him. He fell down and stopped breathing. I found a way out, opened the cellar, and pushed him out of there. I went to the river, threw the frying pan into its dark waters, and sat there until night, weeping. It got dark. It was cold and scary. I wandered home, but there was already alive. Daughter arranged, and the police squad is standing where it was asked to confess. I cannot. Betty won't forgive me. That's how I've lived my whole life, with guilt as a grudge, in general, stated the court clerk. There's nothing you and I can do tonight. It's nighttime. We'll decide tomorrow. It's good you came to me. We'll figure it out. Let's do it by 8 o'clock. Come. I'll do it. Kathy nodded silently and walked away. Stepping heavily, her companion left the lobby and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Shivering like an aspen leaf, Betty stepped out from behind a column. She never saw her mother again and lived with her grandmother Christina until she graduated from high school. No one knew about this story except her mother. Betty was convicted, and she served her sentence in prison. The girl did not decide to follow a creative path in life and decided to connect her fate with pedagogy. She knew English very well, so she chose the appropriate faculty for enrollment. Betty entered the university easily. Her grandmother Christina saw her off as she should. She only told her to get a scholarship so that she had something to live on. She gave away her savings for the first time. And then misfortune brought her to Adriana. She had never had such a faithful and understanding person by her side. Her grandmother loved her, but Betty did not tell her much. She was afraid to disturb her. 87 old ladies after all. Betty studied well. The teachers loved her. On the sidelines, they emphasized that the girl was clearly not modern compared to the permissiveness and rudeness of many students. Her image seemed very nice. She was modest and malleable, did not prove her young, far-fetched right. Discoursed and with respect for interlocutors. The girl did not belong to any group. She did not hang out, did not go to bars and disco clubs. Now she was pretty good at painting and still read a lot. Although Betty was marvelously good, wasn't she? Charles' attention. Until they got to know each other better, she hadn't attracted him. He was acquainted and not with such beauties, so it was hard to surprise a guy with her looks. But the other guys couldn't take their eyes off the girl. Above average height with high full breasts and long legs, it was impossible not to notice her. At the same time, the girl was a natural blonde with blue eyes. She was already unrivaled in her studies, and Betty did not compete with her. She was proud and admired her friend sincerely. After high school, where Adriana was considered too extravagant and independent, at university, she became a leader among other girls. The teachers prophesied a brilliant future for her. She perfectly mastered the materials from the lectures, asked questions to the teachers at home, only covered the knowledge gained. But the girl was actively engaged in self-education, went to the reading room, spent a lot of time on the internet. Time inexorably flew forward. The first and then the second session passed, successfully for both Betty and Adriana. For the summer vacation, they dreamed of going to Moscow together to see all the beauties of the capital. But Betty promised to visit her grandmother who had passed away. When she arrived in her native land, she caught her bad. The woman was lying down more and more and grew weaker by the day. Betty took her to the bathroom, fed her, and washed her. And Adriana, too, went to her own. She was born into a well-to-do family. All her childhood was spent in affluence and care from adults. The girl was a late child, and her parents strived to fulfill her every wish. At school, she studied easily and gracefully. Adriana always had a bright personality and prepared for classes creatively. This allowed her to graduate from high school with honors. It was not easy to say goodbye to her favorite teachers, friendly class, and loving parents. But the desire to live independently won out. And now she came to Kazan and perceived life in her native land in a new, almost adult way. And now she came to her favorite city on her first student vacation. At home, she was welcomed warmly and cordially with an oriental flair. Everyday relatives came. The feasts lasted until the evening, and even into the night. And in the middle of the summer, her parents gave her the keys to a used foreign car and gave her money to learn to drive. It was a royal gift. And already in the second year, already with a friend, came to the university by car. Having met in September, they went to the park to celebrate the beginning of the new academic year. They chose a small but cozy cafe on an open terrace. The autumn sun was still giving the earth warmth and affection. The girls drank champagne and chatted, talking about the summer they had spent. It was good for them to be silent on this September evening, to enjoy a bubble of cool champagne and share their joys and hardships. And then the days flew by. Study went on as usual. Lectures, credits, sessions, perfectly mastered the material in classes, asked questions to teachers at home, only covered the knowledge gained. The girl was actively engaged in self-education, went to the reading room, spent a lot of time on the internet. This is how the first and then the second session passed, successfully for both Betty and Adriana. Soon Betty's grandmother died. She was immediately informed of this by her fellow villagers. The funeral was modest and quiet. The girl was away from her studies for a few days. Adriana supported her in every possible way, sought to entertain, cheer her up. This grief brought the girls even closer together. Betty wiped the tears from her charming blue eyes and returned to reality. And now she was the perpetrator of the grief. Her friend needs to pull herself together and tell her everything honestly. She gathered her mental strength before starting a frank conversation. "Don't cry," he did. She put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Everything will work out." That was all Betty said. She didn't have the strength for the truth. How complicated is this? Charles was thinking. He got on the train and rushed home to his mother's house in his native village. He had to tell Adriana everything. It was a difficult conversation, emotional, tense. It left an unpleasant residue. His soul was in turmoil. He could only find rest in his small homeland in the world of his childhood. A few hours later, he jumped off the train and breathed in. "How intoxicating is the smell of wild grasses and soul hay here," he exclaimed. "What else should it smell like?" Tugged at his shirt, the old caretaker. "Nature is your destiny." "Hello, sweetheart." Charles hugged the bearded man. For as long as he could remember, that overgrown man had been on duty on the platform. Behind that spontaneous frame hair of his, he couldn't see how he'd aged over the years. "But see you later," shouted he to the old man. Between the fences, there was a path in a narrow alley that led to my home. From there, about 200 meters to the right, and a river with leaves as tall as a man on the banks. Charles wanted so badly to dive into its cool waters, to remember how as a child he used to throw full handfuls of water on his boyfriends and the neighbor girl Clara, who pretended to be angry, hiding how pleased she was with the attention of the boys and the warm splashes. The accumulated boys lay down on the beach belly down, and Slaga sent them coarse white sand. After a few minutes, they took to it in awe, and the grains of sand flowed into them as if alive. And until the very evening, When they returned from the river, they raced through the streets of the village to that very mother's signal. And the teenagers came home together in the evenings. Old apple trees, fresh bread, milk from their cow, fried potatoes and vegetables. Father slept in the field camp. Without him, they cooked simple meals, and as night descended and bright stars scattered in the sky, they sat together on the high porch and discussed the past day. Was it warm and cozy often, or just one evening? Charles felt as if it had always been so, and then slept soundly until morning, closed his eyes and imagined white swans that floated on the blue river water measuredly and fabulously. And then sleep came and covered him and took him to its sweet kingdom. Remembered and the first boyish love. When he loved everything with his eyes, it was the neighbor girl Clara, who played with them in childhood, suddenly became not just a friend, but an object of exhaustion. But it was she who awakened the man in him. At school, he couldn't get close to her. He was afraid to say an extra word to her, but he wanted to see her, to know that she was near. The girl had no idea he liked her. She paid no attention to him as an object of love, but in his feelings for her it did not change anything. In kindergarten then Charles, and did not look at girls, and at times considered them nasty. But at school everything changed. And this love was already with a sensual background. She sometimes brought boys, real suffering, tormented and annoyed. It all began with the day when she was transferred to their class from the parallel class. Everyone immediately paid attention to her. They began to discuss how she spoke, how she walked, how she dressed, what kind of hairstyle she had. I couldn't say that she was very beautiful, but there was something special and sensual about her. She had long dark hair, a cute face, big blue eyes. But most importantly, she had a seductive figure. That is, she had everything that conquers men, like a real mature woman, formed high breasts, fall waist, wide hips. It immediately caught the eye and caused a lot of feelings. Yes, and the boy's hormones surging as he looked at her, had a tiring sense of hopelessness, realizing that she would never be with him. He wouldn't work up the courage to kiss her or offer her anything more. Charles called him friend and pretended not to understand his tender feelings for her. At lessons, Charles drew the chosen one. Drew as he saw in profile first on the usual theatrical sheet. One line outlined her smooth big forehead, snub nose, then plump cleful lips. Depicted a graceful, beautiful chin, thin long neck, large ears of hair. Completed the portrait with the image of eyes, large and open the world with long and fluffy, busy upward lashes. When this artistic hobby took a lot of time, the girl noticed and a couple of times quickly looked at him, as if to say, "When will you be from me?" Fed up with your portraits. Her slender little body drove Charles crazy. He watched as if mesmerized as she tumbled on the leather mast, as she did exercises on the bars, and all her movements seemed graceful and vegetable. Everything about her became admirable to the teenager because she was flexible and slender, because she had intelligent eyes, beautiful, thin arms, and a graceful back. And in math class, Charles didn't look at Charles. Otherwise, no matter what he did, the problem or the examples were all wrong. But it was a lack of attention on his part, and she noticed, and sometimes with indignation in her gaze, looked in his direction, as if to say, "What is the news? Are you asleep or what?" Where was the enthusiasm that love had passed? Had the tomatoes wilted? At one of the school nights, he silently asked her to dance, just walked up and pulled his thin, insecure hand out to her. Would she know what it cost? It suddenly seemed to him that the girl would agree to the proposal, maybe falsely embarrassed, willing, but would get up and walk with him to the center of the hall. But she didn't even move or answer him, just hummed something under her nose and turned away squeamishly, as if this invitation was something humiliating or undignified. After that, Charles ignored her for several days, but the need to see his chosen one was stronger than resentment. As time passed, he gazed at her again with his former adoration. He marveled at the way she smiled, the way she talked and laughed merrily, tilting her head back slightly. He loved it when she came in a new dress or stripes with a new hairdo or a new bow. Again, everything about her seemed perfect to him. Even the curve of her arm as she pensively propped her sharp chin with her fist, even the coil of hair that nestled behind her ear. Even the way she curved her lips before crying lightly if she was offended. It had gone on like that for a few years until Clara had cheated on the boy with the high schoolers. She had started to openly make fun of Charles, and her bards had ruined his tender romantic feelings. He must have fallen in love with Betty because she reminded him of his first love. The girl was airy and romantic, mysterious and exultant. If everything was just down to earth, then here emotions lifted Charles to unprecedented heights. He himself became better and kinder. Communicating with Betty, her nobility and crystalline purity captivated the boy and made his head spin. So, remembering the past and speculating about the present, he reached to what at home, and the father and mother in the yard both splash out with their hands. Running, hugging. The pain goes away. The city with its stifling bustle recedes, and in the morning after a long night's talk with his parents comes to Charles. Finally realizing his feelings and solving all his problems, when he returns to Street Petersburg, he goes straight to the girl's apartment. Adriana opens the door and smiles faintly at the distance. Betty shakes her head in different directions. Their eyes are wide open in hers. Charles reads the helplessness. Didn't say, couldn't do it. And he wanted to. He takes the initiative. And Adriana, I'm sorry. He comes over and puts his arm around his beloved's shoulder. We're going to apply to the registry office. Love has Betty guiltily, lowers her head. The girl casts them a glance. She understands everything. But why didn't you say anything? How long have you had it? 6 months, Charles answers. You haven't married her yet, and you've already cheated on me. Adriana is amazed. We couldn't admit it, sighs the guy. Are you sure you're getting your life right? He says to his girlfriend. I can't live without him, cries Betty. Soon they leave the apartment, but the echo of their footsteps echoes in Adriana's head for a long time. Left alone in the apartment, the girl raises her tear-filled eyes to the ceiling. Why? Why? How quickly happiness ended. Not so long ago, Charles was crazy about her. From the first days, he had his eye on the fragile, courageous, and talented Adriana. That's why at one of the corporate parties he looked at her, but didn't approach her, just stood and watched her. Good evening. You'll spend the evening with me. Interesting offer. Alone. We'll see. I'm not like your pretty girls. I see Adriana, and that's not what I'm looking for. Let's give it a try. I've fallen in love, a girl's mind flashed. I realized it was him. My heart was beating like crazy. In the stomach for butterflies can be, she replied. The groomsman. Let's dance. Charles held himself very confidently and gallantly. He took her hand gently and led her around the room, romantic music playing. The girl trustingly laid her head on his chest. The boy's heart was beating. Very strange. Both of them felt an attraction. Adriana reached for him and Charles to her lips. He was enveloped by a voluptuous book. The girl stroked the unruly hair on the back of the guy's neck, and he became even more turned on. He touched her neck gently, correcting the orb, and she stroked her lover's face before giving him a long kiss. After the party, they took a long walk through the night city, cuddling, not shying away from the rare passers-by, admiring the reflection of the stars in the fountains. That's how 2 years ago she met her incredible love-crazy dehydration. It seemed like forever. Adriana remembered how happiness had swept over her hotly and in a wave. It was after their first intimacy. A blizzard reigned outside, and she was walking in a light mini-skirt and a short fox semi-fur coat. The strong wind was gulping, mouth choking, but literally floating above the ground. The reason was Charles. They were so suited to each other, both mentally and physically. It was as if 2 jigsaw puzzles had been put together in the marvelous figure of life. She felt so good with the one she loved. Adriana spent all her time with Charles. If she was not with him, she waited for a call from him, and she only talked about him too. Gentle, attentive. And Adriana would open up to him with all her passion. And then it all came out. Betty and Charles had been seeing each other behind her back, not for a day or two, but for 6 months. The world fell apart overnight. Adriana thought she'd been broken by fate, become ashes, doing things on automatic, drinking, eating, going to class. How did she survive this tragedy? How did she find the strength? How could she look at the traitors every day and behave with dignity? She endured, survived, got out of hell, became a success. She's a wealthy woman to everyone's detriment. Didn't carry a grudge against those who betrayed her. She lived life to the fullest, raised daughters beautiful and educated, taught them that you need to be more careful in their feelings, to be alert, do not allow themselves to use, break, so as not to feel the pain that she experienced. She was surrounded by loving men. One must admit, willing to do anything for his wife. It was she who failed to live with them, to give them what they deserved. After all, Adriana had gotten the most out of life. There was only one thorn in her heart. Charles. There was no one but this man the woman could ever love. So as soon as he showed up on her doorstep and mentioned his desires, she immediately gave in to such intoxicating feelings. Adriana couldn't. She rushed headlong into the abyss of passion, burning both of them from the inside. Happiness was on its way. Every day was a test for the lovers. Secret meetings, deception, the ghost of past failure in love. Adriana was taut as a string. She was constantly on alert. Relationships became disturbingly destructive for her. She forgot herself, constantly thinking only of Charles. She admired him, hated him, idolized him, and feared him. The woman was ready to perform feats for his sake. But after a few minutes, the man forced to think of parting with him. And so in a circle endlessly and agonizingly went days, until he told her that he talked to his wife and left the house. And then it seemed to her that finally she had him and would never let him go. Only a few days ago, he had been fondly putting his arm around Adriana's shoulders. Charles kissed her cheek and said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm very happy with you, and there's nothing more to discuss with Betty. It's over." I told her she was a log in the bed, slammed the door. "I'm sick of living like this. I'm a man. Go on, get undressed. I'll be right there." Charles nodded toward the bedroom. He went to the bathroom, took a shower, and before he went in, he lingered by the window to admire the sunset over Peter. Not for long. He plunged back in time, saw there the blonde, blue-eyed girl he'd met at her friend's apartment. Episodes from their lives swam before my eyes. The birth of their son, family evenings together, their favorite apartment, filled with joy and children's laughter. He was sad, but he convinced himself that he should move forward without looking back. After all, he and Betty are connected only by everyday life and his son. But this is the Borgia of feelings, a delightful intimacy, risky and daring. The woman quickly took him in a turn, gave him a sense of youth and novelty in intimate relations, and he finally gets a divorce and proposes to Adriana. She deserves it. A wonderful lover, a loyal friend, and the smartest of women. The man stretched sweetly and headed for the bedroom. After a few days, however, Charles changed his mind. He was determined to go back to Betty and beg her forgiveness and leave Adriana. He felt it was the right move to walk away from the man he loved to give him the opportunity to live life to the fullest. He saw that he was tormenting the woman. She wanted love, and all she was getting, in fact, was passion. He realized that he could not leave Betty, that he was really attached to her and felt responsible for her, and he just wanted to go home. A familiar environment where he felt comfortable. He insinuated to himself that it was honorable to leave his mistress and tell her everything as it was honestly. She could be happy without him. It was as if he was saving her by leaving. But this sensual drama lacked a final point, and the man decided to have one last date with Adriana. Charles wanted the woman to remember him strong and handsome. He bought a new shirt, shoes, and underwear, but something was missing. And Somov realized the parting gift. The man looked in the jewelry store and bought his mistress an elegant gold ring with emeralds. Charles had thought of everything. First, they would spend time in a restaurant. Then they would go to Adriana's apartment. In the morning, he would say goodbye to her. The mistress called herself. "Charles, yes," he answered. "When I see you, I miss you terribly. I'm going away for the weekend, too. Let's not at my place. We'll go to a restaurant first. I'll treat you to a nice meal. Sounds promising. Let's do it at 6 o'clock. You'd rather swim in ours than on the boardwalk." I suggested it. The woman conspicuously agreed. "I want you every minute of every day. Do you remember that?" whispered the man. "Yes, only I love you more. I love you. I love you. Don't ever forget it," she begged. "I won't, sweetheart," he coined. "I will," laughed the woman, and a red line ran through her head. "I already forgot once." The man turned off. He was frustrated by the conversation. At first it had been easy and fun. He had even forgotten that they were making arrangements for the last meeting of their lives. But Adriana's words reminded him of his betrayal. After all, he had shamelessly forgotten about her when he met Betty. And yet he did not give up on his plan. On Saturday, Charles left work early, went to the store, bought champagne and cognac, bought scented candles and bath foam. A cab started the man to the restaurant. A thick twilight shrouded the city, and rare passers-by hurried home. Illuminated by the matte light of the streetlights, the wharf was empty with only one restaurant on the water. A gentle flute sounded. Charles entered holding a huge bouquet of 35 orange roses. He kissed Adriana and sat down across from her. "You are as usual," he said without delay. And his throat was dry. And so began our last date. We wouldn't see each other again after that. The lovers stayed in the restaurant for a short time, had a drink and a hearty meal. Charles handed Adriana a beautiful velvet box. From the heart, the woman opened it and gasped. What was the occasion? My God, what a lovely thing. No occasion for the most amazing, sensual, and gorgeous woman. My redhead smiled sadly at Charles. I've never felt this good with anyone. You're magical. You are perfection. Adriana looked at her lover and tears welled up in her eyes. No, she wasn't crying. The image of a strong woman wouldn't allow it. So momentary weakness, she felt desire overwhelming her. But outwardly, she did not show it. Charles understood her condition. Taking her hand, they headed for the apartment exit, one arm around Adriana's waist and the other caressing her body. He nudged the woman toward the bed. It had all happened very quickly. They loved each other so swiftly, as if someone had come around the corner and scared them away. Then they lay in the bathtub with their backs against the side of the tub, which was lined with candles. An Argentine tango poured out of the room. Tonight we're going to do something with you that we've never done before, Charles said mysteriously as he tried to do his mistress's hair out of the foam. Charles, I think we've even done things with you that other people don't know about. The woman smiled voluptuously. Adriana, believe me, there are things that you and I have never done. And others, by the way, do it regularly. He continued. That you are just a schemer. I'll do anything. Charles kissed his beloved's wet hand until I could tell the wound. He stroked her breasts. Wake, my soul. All in good time. I'm already out of it. With impatience, at least a hint. You can't. Charles climbed out of the tub, wrapped himself in a towel. I want to give you a bath. He reached for the shower gel. Vanilla for us, Adriana ordered. Great. I love it. Charles licked. He had a mistress on the soap. Trying to memorize the curves of her body with his hands, the scent of vanilla wafted through the room. Charles dragged the woman, then washed off the delicate lather with drinking sprays of water from the shower. He kissed her lips, wrapped her in a big soft towel, hugged her and held her close. What's wrong, Charles? He was worried. Nothing. I'll get the champagne out of the freezer. He went into the kitchen, took out a bottle, sat down at the table, and froze. Memorize it. Every movement, every curve, every word. Soon you'll leave it all behind forever. Knocked around in the man's head, Adriana moved closer to him and put her arm around his shoulders. He poured himself a whiskey. They sat and drank in silence. Music was playing. "Charles, when are we going to do something we haven't done yet?" she asked. "Now you just sit here. Wait a little while. I have to get ready." "I don't feel comfortable anymore," Adriana admitted. "Don't be afraid. It's very pleasant. You'll love it. Hurry up then." Charles took the candles from the bathroom to the room and returned to the kitchen. "Let's go." The man led his mistress into the room. "Let me ask you to dance." He looked into the lovingly green eyes. "Are you serious?" She laughed. "It was the dance that brought us together when we were young. I'm inviting you. But you said we were going to do something we'd never done before in our lives, and we'd already danced. We've never danced naked before. Let's give it a try." He rolled the towel off himself and Adriana and pressed his whole body against her. The man put his arms around her waist, and she wrapped her arms around his broad, naked shoulders, and they began to move slowly to the music. How well Adriana smiled, as if these years of separation had never happened. "You are a genius." She reached for the man. Their lips joined in a sweet kiss. In the morning, Somov could not say everything he had planned to his mistress to her face. He stood and looked at her sleeping woman, smiling. Charles left a note and went to Moscow. What he read made P. Gillen shake all day. She took a bottle of champagne out of the refrigerator and drank it straight from her throat, then sat down in a chair and squeezed her eyes shut. Her eyes, tears burned her cheeks. The woman carefully, so as not to smear the carcass, wiped them with her palms. She hadn't noticed the night had fallen. Going over the details of last night in my head, and her abuser was on the train at the time. He was sure that now he finally realized what kind of woman he needed in his life. However, the meeting with his wife did not bring the expected results. He heard from her cruel words. Betrayed, trampled all your feelings, and now you're waiting for forgiveness. You're sickening to watch. After everything I've learned lately, he tried in vain to justify himself. Betty, I was an idiot. I was wrong about my feelings, but you must realize I've loved you all my life. Beds and true feelings are different things for men. Let's start over. But the wife was implacable. You led a double life, cheated, lied, dodged, and then you wanted out. How many nasty things did I hear about you? That's for my faithfulness in taking care of my son. You've got someone else, and she's my friend, albeit an ex-girlfriend. Do you really think you can take it all back? You betrayed me, you emptied your soul, and now you think it's okay to go on as if it never happened. To move on with me. I don't know how to move on, how to cope, and he wants to shake it off and come back like nothing happened. She threw her husband out and sighed with relief, looking out the window at his and Lena's silhouette. At least some finality. In a week, the woman's soul had undergone irreversible changes. Her love for Charles was gone. All these days after his departure, Betty lived alone in a spacious two-room apartment in the center of Moscow. Every day she got up with the first rays of the sun and watched the sunset over the capital, and an unbearable sadness lay on her heart. She was the only close relative, the only dear person for Charles. She had lived with him years of happiness and sorrows and joys. All in half, she loved him so much she couldn't breathe. It seemed to her that they had been through all the rough patches, but they had endured. Their marriage was strong and long. When Betty heard about the cheating and scandals in other families, he only smirked. How could such a thing be possible? It's like the stuff of fiction. We have real feelings. Charles is madly in love with me. The woman thought they complemented each other organically. They were fun and good. The two of them, joyful and cozy. She was devoted to him, caught every word, with a smile met him from work, saw him off on business trips, and was aware of all the cases. Silent, affectionate, tender. Betty, of course, felt guilty in front of Adriana. It turned out she'd beaten a man off, but she'd made her choice then. Stayed with Charles, cut all ties with her friend. And this is a travesty. Did she deserve it? For him to hook up with Adriana too. Old love never rusts. That's what they say on that principle. She must be better in bed than me, Betty thought. But why did he love me so much and leave her? God, what a horror. Where is the truth? But like a dog in the hay. And such a man always had a family behind him. He wasn't afraid of any responsibility. And now he made such a scandal. He wanted a divorce. He said that Adriana was the bomb. And with me he was wasting time, packed all his things to her. And a week later he flew in with a gorgeous bouquet. He knelt down on his knees and apologized for what he was talking about. How could such a humiliation be forgotten? Betty was perplexed and one evening decided to divorce. After 20 years of a strong marriage, her beloved husband Charles had left her for another woman. Betty felt as if this was not happening to her, but to the heroine of a fictional movie that ended badly. There was hope in her soul that Charles would realize the absurdity of the situation, confess his mistake, and crawl back on his knees. Only she realized that she would not accept the man back. All her feelings for him burned out. However, she wanted to hear from him words of remorse, every night out of habit. Betty beautifully covered the table, opened their favorite with her husband's champagne. But in the light of the setting sun, she sat sad and detached, deeper and deeper, alone with her memories. Maybe I have the wrong idea about love. What does it mean to love? Do we realize the importance of this deep feeling and its overriding influence on our destiny? The very concept of life is inseparable from the concept of love. It is so broad and multifaceted that even the most inquisitive minds have not yet unraveled its mystery. It has always been so, and at the same time, a man inquisitive, looking for a precise definition of what it means to love. Who is a loving person? What proofs of love exist? How do you realize that you love? To this day, in our progressive age, no one has given an unambiguous answer to these questions. At all times, a man needed constant proof that he was loved and needed someone. As a result, many things have come into existence, omen and immutable truths, the presence of which indicates that a person loves or is loved. Many of these truths have remained unchanged through the ages. Some of them are important to me. To love is to forgive. Anyone has the right to make a mistake, and no one is capable of making as many excuses for the wrongdoer as the one who loves him. This is one of the great virtues of love sees no evil. This, of course, has nothing to do with adultery. There's another thing even the church debunks on such an occasion. To still love means to stop comparing. Real feelings can only be for one person. If in a relationship one of the partners compares the other with those he had before, then the sincerity of his feelings will have to be doubted. Falling in love does not mean love. We are talking here about the feeling of falling in love, not long passionate and blind. This feeling is not true love. If the first platonic attachment passes into a serious relationship, only in this case we can talk about true love. To love is to believe. One of the most relevant truths for me, it means trust between a couple in love. The same thing that to love means to trust. Only on trust is a real strong relationship built. Faith in a partner is the linchpin that holds a family together. Cheating means he does not love. Common and most often erroneous opinion. In many families, cheating occurs not because of lack of love. More often spouses decide to her for the sake of new sensations, for the need to be needed, and seem young. Most of those who decided to cheat claim that sex and love are different things. Characteristically, the majority are men. That's what Charles says, and I want to believe that he only loves me. And his son is his passion, but I can't take it back. Love can also be in spite of. Every man has a set of advantages and disadvantages. True love does not pay attention to the negative aspects of the partner. It is accepted to say that a person is loved not for any virtues, but in spite of his shortcomings. That is, love as he is, Such were my feelings for my husband, all loved with the vices of a strong court, successful or wrong. For each person with his or her particular view of the world has his or her own ideas of what it means to love truly. Somewhere I read that an American scientist had compiled a list of a few steps that he believed should lead to true love in a relationship. Betty pulled a notebook of notes from the kitchen cabinet and read them out. The goal of any relationship is to smooth out and heal all childhood heart itches and heal resentments. In a relationship, there should be no illusions. A person should be perceived as he is without expectations. Relationships should be worked on every day in any situation. With a man, it is important to realize that his needs are as important as yours. You should not forget to tell your partner about your own desires. Before projecting your feelings and thoughts onto a person, it is important to understand yourself and try to shield your lover from your shortcomings. In any relationship, it is worth remembering that love is a voluntary sacrifice. Everyone decides for what he brings it, and whether the person who is near the time and effort that goes into the revival of true feelings. The woman read the last lines with tears, and then in her heart she threw the notebook into the trash. Nonsense. All my noble thoughts helped when everything was generally good. It was only the small troubles that disturbed our world. And now she waved her hand tiredly. For a quarter of a century, she and Charles had lived together, fought rarely, reconciled quickly. The son was already a man with a life of his own. As the boy grew up, he knew it was Daddy who was in charge. His decisions were never questioned. In many ways, it was Betty's merit, because she respected her husband immensely. Charles really wasn't afraid to take responsibility. He was always proactive about household and financial matters. She was with him like a stone wall, and just a week ago it seemed to the woman that their life was unbreakable. Everything went on as usual. Charles was actively involved in the upbringing of his son, and Charles did not dote on him. From diapers, as they say, in his teeth, he always found time for his family. When they were young, they often went camping, and then bought a cozy dacha and well arranged it for recreation. Charles always spent his rare weekends with his family, and it seemed that it would last forever. Even when the son flew out of the family nest, the spouses on weekends went to the theater movies, visited the tennis court, and suddenly at dinner, simple and routine, the husband announces that he has fallen in love with another woman and intends to divorce. Betty flares up. A scandal ensues. In the heat of anger, the husband tells her that she's not interesting in bed. Then why did he live all these years? Why? He left her if she was so hot, didn't he? Just spit on her as if life hadn't tied them up in one tight knot. Betty went into shock. Her world just shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't even cry at the news, but her soul cried out. Why? How could he? She had always loved and cared for Charles, and even though she was reserved in her feelings, but tried to support her husband in any endeavor with understanding of his wishes. Since they were young, they were not only lovers, but also the best of friends, and it had never occurred to her that her husband might be attracted to another woman. So much for spitting on the physical side of his relationship with her. She thought he was a very intelligent man, saw his reverent feelings for his family. Betty claimed her husband's eternal fidelity. It seemed to her that they were mentally inseparable. After he did such a thing, she packed up his remaining belongings and left them at the door. He was barred from entering her world. Betty didn't intend to bathe in such lies anymore. Of course, the years had taken their toll, and her relationship with her husband was no longer as passionate as it had been. But Betty felt a tender affection for him. She wanted to take care of him, to protect him from negative information. It seemed that he was happy with their marriage too. He always said that the house was his rear, because not everyday life, not time did not overshadow in her mind the impressions of that significant meeting in their fate. She clearly remembered the details of their acquaintance, and also the bright moments of their wedding, the birth of their son, their vacation at the sea. For so many years, Betty had faithfully loved a handsome young man who before her eyes had turned into a great scientist and attentive father of a family. Her career also did not stand still, from an ordinary teacher to the dean of the university. Yes, and passion made the woman popular in narrow circles. She exhibited her portraits and landscapes in local art galleries. Her son grew up in love, affection. Parental attitude to him was very careful. Even as young adults, Charles and Betty dreamed of having many children. But other pregnancies were unsuccessful, so they gave Charles all their love without a trace. Together, they decided that they would raise their child in a healthy environment. So they resolved all their conflicts behind closed doors, always on his side. As if Spartans protected the boy from all the hardships of life, Alexei grew up calm, respectful, and talented. He inherited his mother's abilities and studied architecture in St. Petersburg. Betty and Charles often met with their son, came to the city on the Neva. But the last time he traveled alone. And as it turned out, he wasn't visiting his son, but his former love. This prank, now, looking into the past, the woman realized that her feelings for Charles had changed over the years. Falling in love had grown into true love. She had become willing to make sacrifices for the sake of their relationship. She understood her husband, his feelings for Adriana. She knew she was a brilliant man, but for him to drop everything and walk away. Betty couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Losing her husband was terrifying. Though disappointment and resentment choked her, her feelings for him were fading. The situation depressed the woman. 2 decades flashed before Betty's eyes in a few minutes. She woke up from her thoughts and walked over to the mirror. From there, a tall, statuesque woman with a well-groomed face and hair looked back at her. She always looked after herself, looked good, and Charles appreciated it. He often complimented her on her visits to swimming pools, sports and gyms, beauty salons. But apparently, beauty isn't enough. Need hot intimacy, sighed Betty, and her words echoed through the empty apartment. After all, he never came to repent again. Yes, that's right. And I don't need to. But I wish time would stop and turn back. And he was still my faithful husband. A week ago, everything was just perfect until that ill-fated day when the rose-colored glasses fell from her eyes. The woman walked to the marital bedroom and opened the closet. In front of her hung a gorgeous evening dress, a slip, dusty rose-colored with open shoulders, and a cleavage area. Betty had gained weight after giving birth, but the outline of her figure had been preserved. Of course, not 42nd, but already 50th size. But thanks to gym classes, the woman's figure was taut. In this dress, she wanted to shine on their 2-year wedding anniversary. Her husband appreciated it then, still in that family's happy life. She poured herself her morning coffee. Vaska was a typically striped cat. The mongrel was getting lost, and her feet an honorable grunt. Betty lifted her cup with pleasure, inhaling the aroma of the budding bottom. Down the hallway of their large 3-room apartment, which they had put all their finances and soul into renovating, footsteps were heard. The nature of this chica beggar's footsteps she would recognize from a 1000. Charles peeked through the open kitchen door. "Betty, what's that bag in the hallway?" "Don't touch it. It's my dress. I bought it yesterday for our anniversary." "Which one is it? You must have made a lot of money. Traveling around on business for your wedding day, bought a woman's mock wedding day." "Oh yeah." Charles had a confused look on his face and grabbed his head. "I forgot. I completely forgot. We should hang it in the closet." Betty thought and carried the bag into the bedroom. She carefully laid out the dress on the carelessly matrimonial bed. Charles came in next. "It's very pretty. You'll be irresistible in it. The one I first went to your place in was better. Give up that simple student one. This one's expensive. You've only gotten better over the years." He put his arm around his wife and held her close. For a day, his Betty broke into a dress, and they romped around the room in a silent dance. The Queen whispered to Charles and plopped her on the bed. "Good thing it's a day off," he summarized, covering his spouse's mouth with a kiss. Betty. It was scary to realize that the magic was over, and now she had to file for divorce. Charles kept calling her again and again asking for forgiveness, but she remained adamant. During the process, the woman met James, the practicing attorney. He was marvelous. Sturdy, stocky, a slouch in the shoulders, prone to obesity, dark blonde with sly gray-blue eyes and a round dimple and on the left chin. He dressed stylishly and very expensively and used designer perfume. When he approached Betty, she melted and became extremely sensual. The Greek god. The woman defined him for herself. She did not know why, but having lost all shame, her mother wrote her phone number on a piece of paper and slipped it into his hand during another consultation. And this god called her. The affair was lightning fast. James captivated her not only with his passion, but also with his intellect. He told her a lot about his work, took her to theaters and concerts. The man unexpectedly fell hard in love with Betty, although he honestly admitted that at the beginning of their relationship he thought it was an easy infatuation. He often came to Betty's house for the night with gifts and flowers. Her love for him was not as intense as Charles. In his relationship with his ex-husband, the central figure was himself, with Betty in a secondary role. The relationship with James was very different. She was on a pedestal. The man adored her, literally idolized her. For him, as they say, on it came to a wedge of white light. He didn't torment her nagging demands for all-consuming attention like a husband. He just loved her wholeheartedly. Betty had confidence in him. She didn't have to prove her love every day. On the contrary, he himself never tired of taking care of his chosen one, striving to fulfill her every wish. In this love was the main thing that guarantees the longevity of the relationship: mutual respect, attention to details, responsibility, reliability, and physical attraction. James was made for family life. He did not like nightclubs, noisy companies, drank only on holidays and then a little. He loved home. For a long time, being a bachelor, the man himself could wash and clean. His apartment was always clean. He loved and knew how to cook. That's why he divided household chores into female and male, artless, honest, and decent. At times, Betty could not believe her happiness. One day, they lay in bed tired of love and were silent. And suddenly, James burst into tears. "Betty, marry me. Enough with the mistresses. It's time to start a family." He looked at her sternly. "Well, what are you going to do?" James silenced the woman. "You know that I'm not divorced yet." Not surprised by the question, she replied. "It's a matter of days. It's time for us to build our own happiness. Do you understand me?" "Of course I understand. Don't think I'm so dapper. Don't think I'm a walker. I just haven't met the right woman. Everything was wrong before you, and you came in. And I, as a boy, all fluttered like lightning. And then I got to know you as a person. And I realized that you're my only one. You're my dock, my home, and my destiny. I won't leave you and I won't cheat on you. I found my harbor. No more traveling. Betty, not Tommy, but would you refuse such a prominent and wealthy guy? Your eloquence is unrivaled." Betty replied with a chuckle. "That's a speech worthy of a man in love. I'd like some champagne, flowers, and a ring to go with it. And a smack on the lips for James. I'll have my sunshine right now." Betty got out of bed and went to take a shower. Now was the word, not a sparrow out. An hour later, the couple entered a small bonfire that moved along the Neva River, enjoying the exquisite views of the ancient town. They drank French champagne and whispered sweetly. Then they returned to the shore and ducked into the first jewelry store they came across. Betty picked out a gorgeous diamond ring. James didn't trifle and asked the salesman to pick out earrings. Betty put them on immediately after paying for them. She was happy and satisfied. She took James under her arm, and together they went outside. There was a fresh, cool breeze. The sun was shining. "But now I must respond to your proposal." The woman turned to James. "But one thing bothers me. Charles is still walking around, standing under the windows at night, begging for forgiveness." Betty sternly wagged his finger at her. Maslikov does not fall into the dope you're already with me. We have a sense of mutual understanding. In fact, with the naked eye you can see that we are made for each other. And this is pity. Well, spoil your life. First of all, yourself. And me, of course, into a bleak, unappetizing grayness. Oh, that's just me. Charles is as useless now as a suitcase without a handle. No, it's too late. It's all trampled on. I'm beginning to wonder if there was love there, to seduce my friend. It's like a sporting interest for me. We've grown apart through him. I blame Adriana. Come on, 3 tearful, conscience still hurt, and asking for forgiveness. Do you think she needs it? You need it, sweetie. First of all, you need it. But enough about them. What are you gonna tell me? I'll give you a ring and a romantic proposal, and I'll get you a bouquet. He nodded toward the flower stand. They accepted the fact that they were lucky. They had known the kind of love that books are written about, music is composed, paintings are painted, and they decided that their bodies and souls were worthy of enjoying that fairy tale every day. That's how I answer you, isn't it? I don't want to fall behind my favorite eloquence. I'm not one to mince words either, am I? That's it, Betty, you're mine, James said enthusiastically. He took her in his arms and carried her to pick flowers. The woman laughed. The wind caressed her face. How far away now was the suffering of her spouse and that life. But in Gillen, it had been very bad for a long time. Once again betrayal. Charles, like a red line in her life. God, how she had loved him, how selflessly she had given herself to him, forgetting that he was someone else's husband. The woman realized from herself that she also wanted to take revenge on her ex-girlfriend. The boomerang returned to you, but satisfaction did not come. The soul was frantically thrashing, taking a vacation at the travel agency at her own expense. She went to Kazan to lick her wounds. She told her parents nothing. And why disturb a dignified old age? And they had no sins. They didn't know any. The plane began to descend. This time Kazan met Pijilin with warm weather. She drove up to the house of her youth and immediately looked into the outermost windows of the 3rd floor. She quickly climbed the stairs and decisively pressed the bell button. The front door bolted on the threshold. Her mother appeared. Her lips quivered, and she did the same. She stepped towards her and pressed herself against her daughter's chest. Mom better smile. Native woman put her arms around her shoulders and kissed her gray temple. Marcel, why are you lying down? Meet your daughter. She took her hand and pulled her into the apartment. Her father appeared in the hallway with a shining face. He's choppy. He hugged her. What brings you to our neighborhood? Passing through, he asked. She waved her head in the negative. No, I just missed you. Cindy offered her hair with trembling hands. I'd cook something delicious. Well, cook something now. Marcel cast an angry look at his wife. And you, daughter, why don't you take a rest from the road? He waved to his wife, and they went into the kitchen. Adriana took off her coat and boots and went into her room. Nothing had changed there. As before, on the bunk shelves stood favorite books. On the sofa lay an old plush plate. She lay down and fell asleep instantly. She dreamed of dark, raging waters. A strong wind was driving a boat through the water. With it she was alone in the vast sea. An oncoming vessel emerged from the fog. A woman stood in the stern, her hands drawn to her. A dirty lilac damp haze shrouded her silhouette, and it dissolved into space. And yet Adriana realized it was Betty, that she wanted her husband back. But he'd already chosen family and said so explicitly, still in the power of sleep, and Adriana opened her eyes and pulled in her nose. The wonderful aroma of roasting meat brought her back to reality. She slipped her feet into her fluffy house slippers and walked out of the bedroom. Mom was fussing in the kitchen. On the table was a plate of colored plentiful. What a regal breakfast awaited me. And Adriana said sweetly, pulling up Sonia's lunch. Cindy switched to a whisper and hurry up and come on. Because my father has been eyeing the brandy since yesterday. She nodded toward the final. but it's fixable. The woman went into the bathroom. Half an hour later, the whole family gathered at the table. After 3 drinks, the host asked his daughter, "I hope you're joining us for a long time." "A week at your complete disposal," answered her. Spread with beer, puffed mashed potatoes, and with a salad of fresh vegetables. Very tasty. A wide smile spreads across Cindy's face. "What are your plans for today?" "What plans?" "I have some suggestions." I agreed to everything in advance. Adriana spent the whole day by her parents' side. They drove to the cemetery in quiet sadness, stood by the dear graves, stopped by the small chapel nearby in the church candle building. Adriana remembered her grandparents, their affectionate looks, and pie-smelling home. Then the Porokov family wandered around the evening city for a long time, admiring the places dear to their hearts. They had dinner in a small cafe and returned home. "Listen, Adriana, we decided to renovate your bedroom so that the granddaughters would feel comfortable when they came to visit. Take the table apart, please," her mother asked. Adriana smiled and nodded, and that evening she cleaned it up, and at the same time she went back to her childhood. Almost the entire contents of the desk consisted of school books in the bottom drawer, notebooks with notes in a neat stack. Something suddenly prickled in her chest as she moved toward them. Here was a picture of her and her high school admirer looking into the lens together, smiling ear to ear. Michael Saylors is an interesting, quiet boy. Loyal never took a step away from her, not handsome, but charming. Why did I reject him then? Here we all look for something in the distance, and next to the good we do not notice. She pondered. Having finished cleaning, Adriana took a bubble bath. She listened to her red hair, put on warm pajamas, and dove into bed. For a long time she couldn't sleep, remembering the moments of lovemaking with Charles. So she got up and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a rum and began to look through the notebook I'd found. Having stumbled upon the number of the school beau, she squinted slyly. "Here, I'll take," and grabbed fate by the tail. "I'll call. What if he's not married? He still remembers me." And so I did. I recognized Michael's voice at once. But just in case, I asked, "Hello, hello. Can Michael hear Adriana?" The man gasped with delight. He was genuinely happy about the call. "Are you here in Kazan?" "I'm at home. How are you doing?" "But what's going to happen to me?" "How are you?" "I'm fine with my job. Prestigious, well paid. I've been married twice. I had twin daughters from my first marriage. The older ones are already students. They live in the capital. And you?" "I work too." The woman felt Michael smiling at the car service. "But you have a great hand from your youth. And a head." "I had to become. I'm the general manager there." The man laughed. "That's how it is. I'm really glad. It's really great." Adriana held her breath. "Do you have a family?" "I don't have one. I lived with one, but they split up. I'll see you around." "Okay. Do you want me to come over there now?" A man came out of nowhere. "No, I'm busy right now, and I'm going to bed." And Adriana didn't expect Michael to be so forward. "Too bad," he was upset. "Then we'll call tomorrow." "Okay." She crawled under the covers and started to remember her meetings with Michael and their high school conversations, and fell asleep in the past. He stayed up all night thinking about Adriana, about how she was now, how their first date would be in so many years. The man still couldn't believe she'd called him. In all these years, he hadn't forgotten about her. The world had turned upside down for Matrosov. He suddenly felt happy. And his heart beat more often with the right to realize his dreams. Everything became different, filled with meaning. The next morning, he called her himself. "The weather forecasters are predicting a downpour by tonight, and the sky is frowning. Come visit me. I'll cook your favorite potatoes under a fur coat. We'll see." Michael suggested comedy. Wow, what details does he remember? Comedy flashed through the woman's mind. "Yeah, it's like a tragedy, and I'm done." That was the end of it. Adriana was so nervous before the meeting that she almost got a migraine. so she took some pills and calmed down a bit. At the door to his apartment, she crossed herself for some reason. She took a deep breath and rang the bell. "Hi." A man with a short haircut shone through. Michael was wearing a white t-shirt and expensive jeans. He looked great, very youthful and modern. "Hi, come in, come in." The man was confused. "Let me look at you. You're adorable, Adriana. You used to be a super girl, and now you're gorgeous." The woman is embarrassed. "Have you changed for the better? Does it suit you?" "Well, I'm a businessman now." Matrosov laughed. "The position obliges. Let me give you a hug." "Yes, please." Adriana, spreading her arms wide, Michael squeezed her in his strong arms, gently stroked her back, and did not want to let go. "Let's eat. I've made it. We'll make it." Adriana slipped out of Michael's arms and sat down at the table. It was obvious that the man had tried very hard. He bought good champagne, cut up a salad of fresh vegetables. He polished the glass and the cutlery. "Shall we turn off the lights? Long live the candles," he asked fondly, looking at his guest. "That'll do." "Zelive," she laughed. Adriana ate with appetite and generally enjoyed the romantic atmosphere. She tried to remember how long ago something similar had happened in her life. A date as nice as this one had failed. No one had ever given her such shared moments and genuine interest in her as a person and a human being. Dinner didn't last long. No one really wanted to eat. They talked more and more, trying to make up for the deficit that had lasted 10 years. She talked more, of course. And Michael listened, reacted emotionally, cheered up in some places, clenched his fists in others. Both felt some non-existent guilt for the loss of those youthful, pure relationships, so they drank champagne greedily to drown it out. So they quickly downed a bottle each. The air was full of reticence, the desire to express their feelings and fear of embarrassment. Suddenly, they would misunderstand the thundering outside the window, the drums, the rain, the sky bursting with bright lightning. Holding hands, Adriana and Michael stepped out onto the loggia. Formidable winds drove black clouds across the sky. In the blink of an eye, the two men were face to face. Michael looked into Adriana's green cat eyes and took in her mouth for a long moment. "I missed you," he said, pulling away from his guest's lips. "You are my knight," she replied in a whisper. They returned to the apartment and went into the bedroom. Their closeness was like the beauty of lilies, purely sincere, delicate. The rolls of thunder grew quieter and quieter. The rain was going away. It washed the city, and by morning it appeared before the regal sun in all its beauty and spring freshness. Michael kissed the woman's neck and whispered, "Sweet girl, how many years have we lost, my fiery fox? We'll make up for it, Michael. Let's catch up for today. The most important thing happened. Fate brought us together and showed us what true love is." Betty married Masliakov and was quite happy. Only one thing troubled her soul, the wound she had once inflicted on Adriana. She gathered her courage and called her. Soon the woman came to Moscow to visit her daughters, and they met in a cozy little cafe on Arbat. The friends sat down opposite each other. "Do you know that Charles has become a chronic alcoholic?" No, she was confused. That's how he began to take it on his chest after the divorce. He swore he loved me very much. But how could he? I didn't notice. I'm Adriana. I couldn't believe what her ex-girlfriend was telling her was real and not a bad dream. Alcoholics are very resourceful, and secrecy is very difficult. Sometimes it's hard to realize a person's missing. I'm telling you that honestly. Let's help him get better. Let's find the best doctors for rehabilitation," exclaimed the woman, desperate. She tried to find a way out of the situation, feeling sorry for Charles. My son and I put him in hospitals many times. He'd hold out for a month or two, and then go on a longer bender. Adriana listened silently. She couldn't believe her ears. "I didn't know anything about it." "Did you know about him being kicked out of the institute? It was useless to do business with him." "I swear I knew nothing." "I'm sorry. I realize I betrayed you and our friendship with a pleading look in my eyes. I asked Betty, "My darling, I don't hold a grudge. It was what it was. If you need support, call me anytime." Adriana said clearly, "I don't need anything. I found my happiness and you. Oh, I can brag too. That's the kind of man he's done the impossible. I've forgotten Charles. I'm living my life fully, joyfully, and without heartache. And for the first time, I feel like a weak woman. It feels so good. You know, I realized that if a woman in the family emancipation, it is true, and the pragmatism of life is that the man allows it to her and not after many years of marriage, and the initial beginnings of the relationship, he benefits from it. Maybe doesn't want to earn more or solve family problems. Wildly afraid of responsibility. He lives a normal life. And suddenly, after 20 years of marriage, the wife is not tender, not caring, not sexy. That's not how it works, bras. Or rather, it happens only in a man's mind. And she didn't possess any femininity from the beginning. Did you give her those qualities yourself, while you were physically attracted to her? How else do you explain that it's all gone? She's changed in a weird way. It's creepy. So who's to blame if they're the ones chasing looks, or the sensual pleasures of it, and they were fooled by them? And then, when brutality went down, tenderness, care and respect were needed and gained value, or bright impressions wanted on the side. True, and a hierarchy of relationships in nature, in that parents lay the personality of their children, and the man makes the woman, in the sense that gives her to open up, if it allows her to be around her weak emancipate in women. The paradox of male failure. This is the male fallacy in that for them, after 40, their priorities change. For them, not for their women. She is the same as she was in the early days of acquaintance, and the basis of cheating and general weakness, cowardice and insecurity. Not enough strength and intelligence to refresh feelings in the family. On strong relationships need to work. Nature is such that a man always leads a relationship, even the weakest one. So no matter how much they cheat, what you sow is what you reap. That's what you said about Charles and me. That's what I said about me too. But now I'm with a real man. Can you imagine? I'm 50, and he calls me a girl and protects me so much. Sometimes it's scary that I could have missed out on such happiness in my life. Oh my God, I'm so glad, Betty said. So, hold your peace. 5. She gave her hand to her friend. She clapped her hand. Of course, peace, and no more black cats will come between us.